With Baldur's Gate 3 being out for over a year now, I think it's pretty safe to say that without a shadow of a doubt, it is easily a video game of all time. Of course, with it being a CRPG, there's a lovable ensemble of misfits that you can recruit and adventure with to aid you throughout your journeys, with each having their own personalities, backstories, goals, motivations, and more that you'll see throughout the course of the game. You could technically go through the entire game without them. Gameplay-wise, and especially story-wise, this is extremely suboptimal to say the least. So of course, with the internet being full of masochists, lone wolf runs have become a pretty niche yet enjoyable way to play the game. We're not doing that today though. Something that I haven't seen anybody attempt is making your Baldur's Gate experience a living nightmare by gluing your player character to an NPC murder hobo that is substantially more powerful than you will ever be, and being forced to live with their terrible actions and decisions. Meet Shadow Davey. You may be thinking to yourself, how did I create this monstrosity against nature? Well, it was really quite simple. I launched 2 instances of Baldur's Gate 3, made a multiplayer game with myself, made 2 custom characters, with the first one being my player character and the second one being Shadow Davey, launched a campaign for both players, kicked myself from my own party while keeping Shadow Davey, installed a mod so that Shadow Davey hit level 12 practically instantly, unlocking all their spells in the process, installed mods that gave them every item in the game so they're in an in-game build right out the gate, as well as an unlimited supply of relevant potions, scrolls, elixirs, and spell slots. If that somehow wasn't enough, I also had a mod that allowed me to also alter all their feats, attributes, ability scores, proficiencies, tags, and pretty much anything else you could possibly think of. Then I installed an AI mod that ensures I can never control the character during combat, with the same exact AI behaviors as if they were afflicted with a madness condition permanently. I think we're gonna have a lot of fun today. First things first though, we have to save our son. Something I wanted to state outright is that we're going to embrace an honor mode-esque no reload policy. That being said though, I'm not even all too sure if it's possible to fail this opening check. In fact, let me go ahead and test something. Okay, so I guess you can actually fail the check. The more you know, I guess. Well, regardless, now that we have our kitty alongside us for the journeys to come, we can look forward to seeing them much later into the campaign, as we are keeping our child as far away from combat as humanly possible, as it can and will be killed if Shadow Davey even dares look upon it. So for now, they're just going to be cheering us on from the shadows for moral support. And I think it helps. I don't know how they made a walking fucked up brain cute. Well, they did. And I think that's pretty respectable.
We will not cause you any trouble, friend! We will project a different form that will cloak us from all but your closest acquaintances. You and your friends shall see us as we truly are. All others shall see a kitty, a small predator, indigenous to this world. They kitties can walk anywhere, and they are most cunning.
Other than that, though, we're just gonna skip over the entire Nautiloid ship. Nothing really happens that's too out of the ordinary, as the challenge only really comes into effect around the Emerald Grove. Although I should note that I do actually have enough experience to level up to 12 immediately, since party experience is shared. However, I'm going to be leveling up throughout the game as normal, if not even a little bit behind the experience curve. And the same thing will apply with some of the mods utilized for Shadow Davey, like infinite spell slots, potions, and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, I can't enable or disable them on a character-to-character basis, but I'm going to try my best to keep a mental note on what I use and don't use, so I don't cast spells that I shouldn't be able to, or drink potions that I shouldn't have. Except for carry weight, though. As somebody who is a chronic hoarder and a warlock, I find the concept of carry weight extremely insulting. Also, I guess while we're here, let's go ahead and go over a few more rules and restrictions for the challenge. Firstly, I'm never allowed to control Shadow Davey, even outside of combat, although obviously some liberties have to be taken there. The main purpose of this rule is so that I can't use Help or Revivify on myself, but also so I don't have the ability to make more difficult encounters much easier by using a preemptive strike, which, especially early on, can easily end encounters before they even begin. On a similar note, I'm also never allowed to manually ungroup Shadow Davey, so they are just permanently latched onto me for the entire playthrough. I can use tactics to try and create distance, but as you're going to quickly see, their effect will be very minimal. That doesn't mean I'm allowed to use hard CC though, so no stuns or other effects that render Shadow Davey immobile or unable to perform actions. The game will always be on Tactician difficulty, and as I've said previously, we're going to be embracing an Honor Mode-esque playstyle without going through the hassle of doing this on Honor Mode because... come on. I mean, saying it would be easier on Honor Mode is a very bold claim, but in retrospect, I do genuinely believe that because doing this on Honor Mode would mean that Help/Revivify would be all but mandatory, which can completely mitigate the entire challenge. And lastly, I will not be using any game-breaking exploits or cheeses. I mean, don't get me wrong, I would love to crash Faerun's economy with the untold power of backpacks and shift-left clicking, or entirely mitigating the entire point of the challenge with some weird legal loophole. But that would be pretty boring, and it's not a Davey Gunface challenge run if I don't make things exponentially harder on myself for no good reason, other than I think it'd be kinda funny. Anyways, that's about it in terms of rules. Actually, I'm going to further interrupt video flow real quick. There's no sponsor today, but I just wanted to barge in here and say that we have a shirt and hoodie of this abomination available over at daveygun.place. And that's actually about all I wanted to say here, so let's get back to the video. Okay, thank you, bye-bye. Back onto our adventure, the first thing that I immediately knew was going to be troubling for us was the frequent use of extremely potent invisible cloud kills. It's honestly really easy to forget what all Shadow Davey casted in a fight, and in the case of cloud kill, it's especially easy when the Chernobyl cloud that can deal pretty insane damage is only really trackable by hovering over Shadow Davey to see if they're concentrating on it. I mean, you can also hover over terrain, but I noticed that the spell effect is actually slightly bigger than what the game tells you, so doing this is slightly inconsistent. This on its own is already pretty awful for us, but the worst part by far is that Shadow Davey will also concentrate on keeping it up for a while. About a minute in real time, I believe. So later on in the playthrough, whenever I see it casted, I genuinely just ignore that area for a while and do some backtracking or looting until the effect wears off. That or I'll literally just AFK. Sometimes you're just forced to do that. It honestly reminds me of a MOBA gray screen, where the only thing you can do for a while is just move the camera around in general disdain. But somehow even more depressing than that, because you usually load into a MOBA match half expecting to feel disappointed. Why must I ruin all the games I love? This is a recurring theme in my life, and it's not problematic. It kind of is. Whatever. This is but the first of many incidents in which we'll wish we could control our genocidal maniac of a party member. But to be totally fair, besides the Vault 87-esque radiation poisoning, things were actually going pretty good. We recruited Shadowheart, we recruited Asterion, Gale, Lae'zel, and it's probably a good time to mention that we will pretty much never be joined by any other party members throughout the rest of the run. Not because I don't want to use them, but because there is no way in hell that I'm going to be able to keep them content with me. Remember that Shadow Davey is technically their own player character, and as it turns out, killing somebody repeatedly is not a fantastic way to earn their trust and respect. And chances are if they're upset with them, they'll probably be upset with me by proxy. I mean, I guess we could have used Hirelings, but come on. Honestly, I would have loved to have Shadow Davey be the Dark Urge, but I feel like that would break something later on down the line, and as you're going to see, we're going to be experiencing a lot of weird shit in this playthrough. I will be discussing more about companions later, as I do want to do their quests because my heart just doesn't have the capability to be rude to Karlach or Gale. But for the time being, we killed some goons, freed our boy Withers, and stumbled across the Druid's Grove, which was just... it was an incredible experience. Shadow Davey took personal offense to these three asshats existing, killing off Barth with a cloud kill, Aridin with a fireball, and later Rhaenyra with their best low-tier god impersonation. Then they directly blasted Zevlor in the face with a scorching ray before Will and I finished the fight before more damage could be done. Considering what just happened, Zevlor's response was about what you would expect.
Aridin didn't make it. Pity. But he might have got more of my people killed, if not for you. Thank you for your help out there. I'm Zevlor.
Honestly, I'm gonna choose to believe that Zevlor is reacting this way just because he fucking hated those three idiots, but trust me, NPCs won't be too fond of giving us the benefit of doubt for long. Also, two things to mention real quick. Firstly, Shadow Davey is going to be frequently abbreviated to SD for the rest of the video, as that'll probably save countless seconds of both of our lives, and also, secondly, Shadow Davey's portrait is just entirely black. This wasn't at all intentional, it's just a thing that happened, but honestly, I found it pretty fitting. I know how to change it, but I think keeping the portrait as a black abyss for the rest of the run is a lot funnier than anything I could potentially add in. Especially when you look at my portrait, which just looks like the Baldur's Gate 3 equivalent of the depressed Chad meme. I think it works out. I digress though. After talking to the locals, it's time to go rescue a stupid idiot child from some harpies. I perished in my first attempt to do so because Shadow Davey decided I should be stuck in the middle of a cloud of daggers, but I can't even be upset because immediately afterwards they pulled off an 800 IQ move against the harpies by attempting to kill the child so that they can't, which actually worked. Somehow. I tried to look up if this was an actual strategy, but the top result was a forum thread with the insightful quote, "The most woke part about this game is that you can't kill kids." Honestly, I'm not even going to click on the link or profile to see if this was satirical, because the thought of somebody playing through a game where you can have sex with a literal gay bear and crossing the line at the inability to commit pedicide is really fucking funny to me. Oh yeah, also, apparently Gale approves of this course of action. Yeah, I don't know what's happening in this fever dream of a playthrough, and chances are you won't either. So, this would be a good opportunity to talk about the class that I wanted to go for. I really wanted to find ways to displace or otherwise push/throw SD away from me. which originally entailed respecking into a Berserker at level 4 and utilizing elixirs of Hill Giant Strength so I could safely boost up my Constitution to 18 with Tavern Brawler without having to compromise on offensive prowess. That was until I realized that they casually weigh over 13,000 kilograms. Like, they're not carrying 30 tons, they just are 30 tons. I don't know how, but frankly I'm just not going to question it. So after this revelation, the next best option in my mind was sticking with Warlock so I could spam Eldritch Blast to deal some pretty considerable damage without being in the front lines or relying on spell slots. All the while creating distance between myself and Sans. Well, more accurately, distance between our enemies, myself and Sans, because again, 60,000 pounds. It's also a massive help that our damage scales with Charisma, so boosting that up not only means that we'll be more lethal in combat, but we'll also be able to pass more difficult dialogue checks with a fair amount of consistency. And of course, since Baldur's Gate 3 is a role-playing game, being good at talking tends to be ridiculously OP. That being said, while fighting my way through the Goblin Camp, I quickly realized that my combat strategy just wasn't going to work as effectively as I hoped until Eldritch Blast gets another charge at level 5. You see, the problem is that SD can teleport. A lot. And my attempts to flee or otherwise escape from their wrath only seems to provoke it further. And since every spell they regularly cast will instantly kill us, we really need to avoid combat like the plague, so we're going to do a quick respec to unlock this guy's self so he can transform into a Femdom Drow and avoid all the potential upcoming fights. Except for the owlbear fight that I did way earlier. Despite what I literally just said, I know that you can skip this fight with ease, but at that time, I really wanted to fight it just to see my murder hobo in more action, and that ended up being a complete mistake. It was like 10 or 15 minutes of reloads. Not by choice, mind you, but because the owlbear has enough of a health pool to tank a few hits, and since we have 2 other idiots joining us into the fray, this made the Madness AI especially murderous, since it heavily prioritizes casting spells that can affect as many targets as possible, which usually resulted in me getting immediately sunbeamed, sometimes twice, and instantly dying. Yeah, I decided for the authentic CBT experience that SD should have comically high initiative, and although I do think it's the correct choice, it's one that I'm sort of regretting. Which honestly confirms that it was probably the correct choice. Well, for some good news for a change, the save that managed to fell the beast did keep the owlbear cub alive, so in my mind, all is right in the world. Totally worth it. Anyways, this may be a good time to mention that, despite what my golden dice may tell you, I don't really know a fucking thing about D&D. Don't get me wrong, I know my way around CRPGs, but if I'm being honest here, I beat Honor Mode because Gloomstalker Ranger and Tavern Brawler Throw Zerker can kill pretty much every boss in the game in one turn single-handedly. So obviously with a full party of obnoxiously OP nonsense like that, yeah, the game just didn't really stand a chance. Anyways, the reason I'm bringing this up is because I know for a fact backseating will occur, and frankly, I'm not discouraging it. As somebody who makes YouTube videos on a semi-regular basis, it's to be expected, and to discourage it would be legitimately dumb. But I am going to let you know that you'll probably enjoy yourself more if you watch me suffer and don't think too hard about what you would have done in the scenarios that I put myself through. Honestly, I just want to be the YouTube equivalent of a horror movie where you just get to watch the protagonist make exclusively incorrect decisions in despair. And I would sincerely recommend watching this video as such. With that disclaimer out of the way, after the owlbear cub was liberated, I went ahead and rescued Scratch. then proceeded into the Blighted Village to get the Necromancy of Thay and Shovel. Luckily, I can just use Mage Hand to skip the lockpick and trap checks, although I'm not going to attempt to read the book for a while, as I want to get to 4 Inspiration before even considering it. But we do have it at the ready when the time comes. Shovel, though? Poor bastard. She had one job, and that was to absorb some incoming fire that would inevitably be hurled towards our general direction. If you don't know, these summons in particular can die, but they won't actually perish. They can just be summoned later, totally okay. For example, I know that seeing a dog get blasted with a fucking fireball is hardly the most enjoyable time, but since we can deploy Scratch directly onto the front lines without any risk of the good boy actually being hurt, he would actually be one of the best familiars in the entire game, as he can help down party members without any investment. But I feel like that's a little bit disingenuous for the challenge, as the best strat would just be keeping Scratch far away from combat and playing the game as a see if my character passes 3 death saving throws simulator. Or better yet, just skipping over that potential fail state altogether with an incredible item we'll be getting later into Act 1. Yeah, I would definitely qualify that as a challenge-breaking cheese. I believe I specified Shadow Davey in the rule, but for all intents and purposes, using Help or Revivify on myself is essentially disabled. I believe the ambulance agrees with me. Back to Shovel, though. She doesn't have that going for her, but I think it's a relatively fair trade because she does sometimes say things like this.
Feasting time! It's your trouser holes! Shovel is here!
So, yeah. All in all, I'm pretty happy with our new acquisition. So now that we have our sacrificed daughter, I succeeded a pretty difficult check which got some ogres to join our cause. Well, rather, I should say that I could hypothetically get ogres to join our cause because the damn summoning horn has historically always been a I'll save it for a difficult encounter item that I just never actually use. And that is coming from a dude who actually doesn't really experience that feeling in games. Anyways, afterwards I skipped past all the potential gobbo fights, and after doing some more shenanigans around the area, we hit level 3. This isn't a massive power spike for us, but it is another step closer to level 4 and level 5. I'm not worried about the goblin camp as of right now, so since we passed through the outposts relatively unscathed and unlocked a waypoint, I'm gonna go ahead and respec back to Warlock. There isn't much incentive doing this right now, but there also isn't really a point in keeping leveling Bard either. We're gonna have to do it eventually, so we may as well get it out of the way. Also, in case you're curious as to why I am half naked, it wasn't just to look at my comically large drow titties in every cutscene prior to respecking. I just don't have a robe yet, just light armor. And equipping my bracers of defense and unequipping my armor actually increases my armor class, but now that we don't have disguise self, you're just gonna have to look at this absolute unit of a man for about a minute or two. If you need to pause the video and take a few minutes, I totally understand, by the way. I wouldn't consider myself gay, but something about the thought of those abyssal black eyes piercing your soul just... What am I doing? What am I saying? Anyways, I rescued my second son from captivity. Well, the third son in total, but the second one that was taken captive. We do have a daughter who was debatably taken captive, so it's the third child from captivity and the fourth child in total. I'm really starting the most dysfunctional family in all of Faerun here, and Somewhere along the way, Shadow Davey drank some cookie juice, and if I was sure that they were never going to die previously, that is all but a certainty now. Even the mythical throw or shove your enemy into a chasm strat that the loading screen keeps suggesting isn't going to work because the guy is unmovable. I would say that they're the Baldur's Gate 3, but that would be misinformation, as the main antagonists are literally the Dead 3. I mean, of course, there's the Absolute, which is the main antagonist, but the Dead 3 were the ones who enslaved it as a weapon and kicked off the events of the story in the first place. What I'm trying to say here is that Larian understood the assignment. Also, I went back to the Emerald Grove to obtain the Mind Flayer parasite from Nettie's room because I completely forgot to talk to her, so it's probably a good time to mention that I will be injecting the gummy worms directly into my brain because there's virtually zero reason not to. If you're somebody who really likes the RP and or the look of your character, yeah, you can definitely avoid them, and that's a viable decision. I'm not even saying this to be condescending, but I make loads of suboptimal decisions for the sake of RP or simple gameplay preference. In fact, the reason I'm so blatantly apathetic towards this choice is because I sincerely hoped it would be way more punishing. However, for what I'm sure most people would initially consider a fundamentally game-altering decision, the repercussions being limited to a single check where you may be forced to develop spookier eyes that are hardly referenced outside of a few lines of companion dialogue. I mean, seeing as the difference between one tadpole or every tadpole is non-existent, and the difference between one tadpole or no tadpoles is minimal at best, we're going to be embracing the wormies. Especially because it does actually look pretty damn dapper with our character. Anyways, I digress. In regards to what powers I wanted first, I prioritized obtaining Shield of Thralls ASAP, as 10 temporary hit points can frequently be the difference between life and death at lower levels. And since it recharges on short rest, I'm going to be getting a lot of mileage out of it. I did also get a few displacing powers to see if they worked on a 60,000 pound entity, but alas, no luck. At least it'll eventually contribute towards Call of the Week. Besides that though, how we want to progress through the story is kind of a jumbled mess right now. Particularly, I really want to avoid the Shattered Sanctum, as there is a distinct possibility that Halsin will be killed in the chaos if we rush it. And similarly, it's completely possible that my wifey will meet a similar fate. So we're going to be putting these confrontations on a back burner until we're more suitably prepared. So for the time being, it's kind of bizarre to admit, but this might be one of the only Baldur's Gate 3 challenge runs in which doing the content in reverse order, hardest to easiest, is actually an optimal play. Like, we're talking level 3 Underdark and Grimforge here. I'd include the Mountain Pass, but unfortunately traveling there before rescuing Halsin will conclude the Rite of Thorns, which just fucks up so many things for us. So for now, let's go ahead and pull a triple whammy by gaining access to the Underdark, as well as getting my dwarf some goddamn clothes and the ability to read. Of course, this means it's arachnophobia time. So fortunately this fight wasn't all too terrible once I figured out the strategy. Firstly, I lure SD into a spider web, then I Eldritch Blast a web, which sends them careening straight into the Hell Pit. Then, assuming I pass the stealth check, I can just sneak away unfazed while their epic anime duel plays out. Even saying that though, I was still very vulnerable to getting detected and subsequently run down by the brood of teleporting spiders. For example, there was an attempt where it was just a 1v1 between SD and the Matriarch, but unfortunately I made the classic blunder of thinking that I was probably safe halfway across the damn country. The spider did not particularly agree with that. But don't you worry, folks. My evil doppelganger, being the most powerful being I've ever had the displeasure of knowing, responded to this predicament by pulling off this epic maneuver. Incredible stuff. Truly. Well, that was our closest attempt down the drain after 20 minutes of continuous retries, but luckily, fate was on our side as the beast was finally slain on our next attempt. So, as promised, following her demise, I got myself a robe that is entirely useless for my build, but is remarkably an article of clothing. And we still don't have 4 inspiration yet, so I'm holding off on reading the book. But now we do have the ability to read the book. But it was at this moment I had to investigate something. I think I read something somewhere that fall damage should theoretically have a damage cap. And I mean, it makes sense versus terminal velocity. If you could survive a fall from 5,000 feet, you could probably survive a fall from 1 billion feet. So, could Shadow Davey survive this descent without Featherfall? There's only really one way to find out, so here we go. Game? You alright there? You need a minute? Alright. I get it. No rush. Okay, it's a little bit concerning now. Oh god fucking damn it, the answer is no. Anyways, I went back to buy a Scroll of Featherfall, entirely unaware of the fact that I already had a Scroll of Featherfall in my inventory. But I did also buy some dye, which made this robe look absolutely baller as fuck, so we do have that going for us. So, with our drip obtained, it's into the Underdark we go. Since we're dropped off right here and we have a few more turns of Featherfall remaining, I decided to visit the Myconid colony as it's the closest available waypoint. There's no enemies in the way of reaching it, and some extremely good loot for a character can be found there. I mean, the mushrooms were justifiably a little racist towards me, but after some dialogue, we were welcomed into their ranks and asked to kill my own kin, which I'll happily oblige with because Dwergar are absolute assholes. And of course, while we're here, I may as well hit up the local merchants for some loot. I don't want to thoroughly discuss every vaguely notable item I acquire, but I picked up these 3 items in particular so I could cast Healing Word, Mass Healing Word, which is effectively just another healing word for us, Scorching Ray, and Magic Missile fairly regularly. All of which are pretty good effects as long as I remember to swap the item out after using up the spell. So with our newfound items in hand, I decided to begin our adventure towards the lake. And fortunately for us, after a few failed attempts that were ultimately very preventable, killing off the Dwergar intruders ended up being no problem at all. And returning to King Mushroom with our Tales of Glory, we are properly rewarded with a Shadow of Manzo-Baranzan, which gives us a once per short rest action that gives us invisibility for 2 turns. Which won't be useful forever, but is extremely handy for the time being. More importantly though, our main character is just dripped the fuck out at this point, so that's always a plus. So moving forward, Grimforge was similarly easy to clear out by utilizing this platform right here. The Dwergar are pretty reluctant to try and get to you here, which means that utilizing a decent ranged build more or less trivializes the encounter. The only thing that I thought may be a complication were the Mine Masters potentially targeting SD, but as it turns out, a pretty good counter to losing control over your character is never being able to control your character in the first place. So things worked out pretty well for us. Also, for legitimate complaint, I always dread meeting the Dream Visitor, as your playthrough becomes cursed with interjections of, "that won't work," or "try something else" every 17 goddamn seconds. But honestly, all of that annoyance was totally worth it for this absolutely glorious moment right here.
That won't work.
Never change, imps. Never change. Anyways, while the Dwergar were easy to take out, Nier was slightly more troubling for us. I don't really think it was possible to kill Nier without at least one of the Iron Hand gnomes dying in the crossfire, which kinda sucks. It also didn't particularly help that I attempted to rescue this stupid idiot who gets killed by Nier by initiating combat before the cutscene plays out, which I later figured out was entirely pointless. Even if you're an absolute Giga Gamer and kill Nier in turn-based mode before he's given an opportunity to attack, this character just disappears. Lost to the abyss. Forever. Overall, just a completely worthless endeavor. I'll be honest, I didn't really expect Schrodinger's gnome to be a thing in this game. Is the character alive if I never start the cutscene? She should be, but I can never confirm that because the character doesn't spawn. She doesn't exist. For all intents and purposes, Nier just has the ability to summon a fucking gnome just to throw it into the lava. It's really funny, honestly. I'm keeping that taken because for some reason the thought of just somebody just summoning fucking gnomes and throwing them in the lava whenever they're mad is really fucking funny to me. Alright, I think I'm good now. Probably. Anyways, Nier took a few retries because Shadow Davey was very fond of hitting us with sunbeams or lightning bolts, but eventually we got him down with Beldron being the only casualty. It could have been a whole lot worse, as in every single Iron Hand gnome here dying worse, so trust me, this was a good result. Also, speaking of collateral damage, we need to talk about spacing and positioning because I'm starting to notice trends in Shadow Davey's AI. Specifically who they target, what spells they use, and why. For an obvious example, I never want to be around a cluster of enemies because that will almost always result in me getting cloud killed or fireballed. As a warlock, this isn't a particularly damning predicament. It will become much more problematic in later areas where we'll be facing much more enemies with increased mobility options and offensive pressure. But for now, avoiding the front lines is simple enough, and enemies don't have too many ways to close the distance, so this isn't really an issue. Something that is infinitely harder to account for, though, is never being aligned against an enemy when combat starts. If you can connect an uninterrupted line between myself and one or more enemies, I'm in danger. That's because the AI heavily prioritizes maximizing sunbeams and lightning bolts, so when combined with our high initiative and Misty Step / Hellcrawler, we're all but certain to die if we enter an encounter this way. It's also important to consider how far away we pull enemies. Of course, starting an encounter too close all but assures a painful death, but simultaneously we also can't start combat too far away, because SD will then prioritize blasting me, as they don't have to move or use a bonus action in order to target another entity. So there is a bit of a Goldilocks zone for distance. Also, this is very bizarre and I can't really prove this, it could just be confirmation bias, but I believe that the Madness AI will prioritize a target near a bunch of destroyable objects over a target that's isolated, so that's yet another weird thing to consider. All in all though, I found that the most consistent variable for surviving encounters is easily elevation. Being above Shadow Davey increases survivability substantially. Even being on the same level as them, but being above our enemies, makes things so much smoother for us. do keep in mind that this is still far from a surefire solution, as some spells like Ice Storm will still damage me, and at this point in the game usually kill me. And as always, the more or less infinite Misty Steps and Hellcrawlers means that I can never be too far away from them, which makes their tendency to push me off ledges all the more concerning, so there are still predicaments to consider. Of course, with all that being said, sometimes even in optimal conditions, the Madness AI will just kill me, because why not? Specifically note that I'm saying that the AI will prioritize certain actions and not that it'll always take them. Regardless of positioning or strategy, some fights will just begin with me instantly getting nuked, and truthfully the only thing I can really do about that is to take those moments in stride. The main point of including this segment is describing how and why I'm trying to optimize encounters and where I start them. There's tons of other things to consider. For example, Minor Illusion will be an insane spell throughout the entire run, as starting combat with multiple enemies near each other will almost always assure a potent AoE spell will be used. And as always, summons and familiars are going to be immensely useful for redirecting damage, especially so if they can get into range before initiating combat. I find that a fantastic tanking strategy is to direct them to stay between enemies to form a line to essentially taunt the Madness AI into using one of their beams as previously discussed. But all of this is a lot more self-explanatory, so I don't feel like it needs to be explained in as much depth. So overall, here's my priority list. Keep in mind that none of these are mutually exclusive, and it isn't always going to ensure our survival, but it's best to increase our odds whenever possible. Anyways, with most of Grimforge's inhabitants dealt with and looted for all their valuables, I went back to the Emerald Grove to clean out my inventory and realized that I was leveling way faster than I initially thought. My character is currently stuck at level 3, but much to my surprise, I'm actually extremely close to reaching level 5, which is actually one of our most vital levels. So let's go ahead and pick up ability improvement for extra charisma and find some more idiots to kill so I can get there ASAP. But while we're on this journey, one thing that I'm sure people have been yelling at me to do that I just haven't found all too important yet, is setting up a camp buffer. Of course, I've already mentioned that bringing companions along isn't all too practical, but that doesn't mean that I can't make lazy slouchers like Shadowheart or Starion do their part. Realistically, I should have probably had Longstrider since the beginning, but now that Aid is a proper spell that can be upcasted for another 10 maximum hit points, yeah, we're gonna go ahead and set up our camp buffers. But with all this being said, there's a problem now. A rather big one, at that. Since we're now level 5 and have access to multiple effects that boost HP and temporary HP, sometimes we might survive a spell from Shadow Davey. It's even been observed in rare scenarios that I might be able to survive too. I don't know if I can stand for that. My first solution? Multiplicative. Let's just add in another Davey. This time one that's specialized in throwing excessive amounts of IEDs rather than casting spells. There's a bit of a problem with that solution, though. Have you ever played through a video game where there's a main antagonist that you struggle against throughout the entire story, then after a critical plot point, a new, more powerful antagonist emerges and the two start fighting each other for supremacy? Yeah, unfortunately the idea is fundamentally incompatible with how the AI distinguishes potential targets. If we're shooting for a priority arrow for party damage, we're currently stuck in a priority triangle, and it's impossible to balance this point without negatively affecting the corresponding sides. Especially so because this side is extremely volatile due to these 2 points absolutely hating each other. So for an admittedly kind of boring yet straightforward solution, we're upping Shadow Davey's stats. They unlocked yet another action point, a buff to their spell attack rolls and spell save DC, all their ability scores are raised to 20, their initiative is further raised by another 10, and they now have significantly more spells that they can cast. Joy to the world. Anyways, I still wasn't prepared to go through the Shattered Sanctum just yet, but I figured I could clear out the Goblin Camp itself, which was pitifully easy, as you've probably noticed. Most of the enemies here are positioned in a way where just one fireball or cloud kill can instantly kill all of them, and yeah. In one turn, most of the Goblin Camp was wiped out and the few remaining stragglers were swiftly dealt with. I mentioned it already, but Minor Illusion is actually a contender for one of the very best spells in the game for us, and it's one that'll never fall off in viability. It is extremely powerful, and it will always have a dedicated spot in our toolbox. Anyways, following the massacre, I really wanted to obtain Crusher's Ring for yet even more mobility, but I saw an opportunity to push him off of a bridge, and I figured that he would land on solid ground, but instead he fell into a chasm, which costed us precious loot. Whoops. At least all the other corpses had some decent vendor trash, and hey, we may not have Crusher's Ring, but just like the Disney Star Wars sequels, we fly now. And we also have Mage Armor. And 2 charges of Eldritch Blast. And, most importantly, we have invisibility. And guess what? My gambit from all the way in character creation was a success, as my doppelganger is totally happy to lead the charge in conversation if I run past everything while invisible. And since this invisibility effect can be used whenever, is completely free, and lasts indefinitely, this is obscenely helpful in avoiding fights. Hell, even in combat, you're limited to only being able to use it once, but if you cast it and move away from your starting position, you'll almost never be targeted by anyone, which is insanely good. However, upon pulling this maneuver off like twice, I quickly realized that extensive use of this would definitely be considered a challenge-breaking cheese. Like, don't get me wrong, it's far from uncounterable or unbeatable, but since we're never allowed to ungroup each other, now a lot of the game can just be completely invalidated by simply running to a location while my evil clone slowly makes their way to my position, utterly annihilating everyone who dares stand in the way of their warpath. So, I'm not going to completely disable invisibility, as I think it has some interesting interactions for the future. And again, it's far from uncounterable. Despite what trade chat would probably tell you, invisible is not synonymous with invincible. But it is so good that I am going to limit its usability substantially. Besides that, though, all in all, as I said previously, level 5 is one of our most critical power spikes, and this massive boost in power is going to be extremely helpful for us. Even more so since we're in that stage of Act 1's progression, where we're pretty much just crossing things off a checklist while procrastinating the Shattered Sanctum, and by proxy, the Mountain Pass. The Putrid Bog is another obvious direction, but that is going to be slightly intertwined with the Shattered Sanctum, so what does that leave us with? A lot, actually, but let's start with Gnolls. Although in most playthroughs this encounter can be ruthless, they were pretty easy to handle here. And by taking care of them, we obtained access to the Zentrim hideout, which we'll be hitting up in just a minute. Before that, though, we went ahead and recruited Karlach into our party, and making use of this high ground, we were easily able to kill off the Paladins of Tyr, even if I was nearly burned to death immediately afterwards. Fortunately, we were able to flee back to camp before getting incinerated, but after the fires faded, we picked up a pretty decent chunk of gold hidden within the basement and pressed on with our misadventures. We then went to Joaquin's Rest, rescued some idiots, obtained the Spell Sparkler, which is incredible for us, went to the Zentrim hideout and got my reward for rescuing those two doofuses from earlier, bought a few items that aren't really worth mentioning now, but may be useful in future builds, decided to finally read the Necromancy of Thay now that I have 4 inspiration, which allowed us to pass all of the required checks with ease, stole an Infernal Iron from the back of the hideout for Karlach, talked to Damon to install it, traveled back to the Underdark, killed Boulette, killed a Spectator with some clever positioning, progressed through the Arcane Tower so I could buy some special items from our boy, which, by the way, I've been skimming over loot a little bit, and that's because we'll have a dedicated loot segment soon. Then I decided to return to Grimforge to get a few more items, and then finally confront the man himself. Honestly, the journey to Grim on its own was actually pretty difficult because of the method ambushes that we'd encounter while trying to get our mithril ore. But after a few attempts, I was able to retrieve my ore, and I already retrieved the molds I wanted, so it was time to head to the forge. While I was making my way there, I initially figured that the Grim fight would just be a complete slam dunk. Not only is 450 HP totally reasonable for SD, but of course there's a few cheeses you can pull off which completely invalidates the fight for us. We're not level 6 yet, so we don't have the owlbear from the top rope strat, but we do have access to the minor illusion strat and the stair strat. To be fair, there's actually some nuance to these cheeses, as SD is more than happy to blast me if I remain in their line of sight, which is a massive issue as I need to keep hitting the lava valves so that Grim remains vulnerable. And after a recent-ish patch, lava methods now spawn during the fight regardless of whether or not you use the hammers, so that's yet another variable to account for. But in the end, killing Grim wasn't the hard part. This was the hard part. Okay, weird, but it was to be expected. I'm playing with a ton of mods, so I'm actually surprised we got this far without a crash. I mean, it sucks that we have to redo the fight all over again, but I kind of have the strategy down, so redoing the fight isn't going to be all too bad for... Sure. Fine. I guess. Maybe it's a glitch with how we're killing it. Killing it from the high ground shouldn't ever result in the game crashing, but if this was the case, it would be far from the most confusing or reverse solution or workaround to a problem I've encountered. So let's go ahead and try to pull off a strategy where we kill him on equal footing. Before that though, let's go ahead and jump on down, take a long rest to get back some of our resources, and... Ah, I see. Alright, tech troubleshooting time. It is very important to figure out if this is a new problem specific to this encounter or area, or if this is a problem that has been lying dormant for us for a while now. So let's try long resting from a save a few hours ago. I don't see any reason as to why that would... Fuck! Yeah, it appears that my save is bricked. So, firstly, something that a good few of you are probably thinking to yourself. I know that a lot of people have struggled with this glitch before due to the Party Limit Be Gone mod, especially so because it's one of the most popular mods for the game, but that wasn't what was happening here. It was something much, much worse. But this isn't my first rodeo with video game modding being the bane of my existence, so I was prepared to lock in for a few hours to rescue my save. Also, in case you're curious as to why this was so urgent, not only am I losing out on hours upon hours of gameplay, but even assuming I loaded back to a very early save and just never long rested for the rest of the playthrough, that only delays the inevitable, as there are a few moments where you are forced to long rest, with one actually coming up fairly soon. Also, to state the obvious, that would be incredibly inconvenient. I mean, never long resting can actually be a viable playstyle with proper party compositions and pre-planning, but it's one that I wasn't setting up, so it'd be very scuffed. More importantly though, skipping long rests means that we would never find our son, so that just isn't going to be an option for us. So, over the course of nearly 4 hours of torment, I tried all sorts of different fixes to get past the screen, but ultimately it was to no avail. Sometimes I'd get to see the Dream Visitor cutscene that's supposed to play when I long rest. For example, killing off Will seemed to do the trick, as we would normally have to go through his cutscene with Karlach when we decide to rest. Which, by the way, is a legitimate strategy. But immediately afterwards, it would just take us back to square one with no real progress being made. But eventually, after non-stop trial and error, including but not limited to reading dozens, if not hundreds of forum posts, adding and removing mods, launching 2 clients of BG3 again just so I can invite myself back to my own game and take control of both Davies, attempting to rest in different saves to see what's different, chatting to everyone in camp, killing everyone in camp, killing specific individuals in camp, attempting to camp in different locations and about a billion other things that could just be described as dumbass game dev testing QA hell. Near 2 o'clock at night, AM, I finally figured out the solution. Are you ready for the most Davey shit you've ever heard? Gale. I think he's a rather funny man. He has a very self-aware sense of humor, and it is blatant that he uses it as a coping mechanism, but in a way that's actually funny, and isn't just irony-pilled Zoomer quote-unquote self-deprecating humor. You know, being a generally retrospective and open person who wishes to make light out of bad situations and not just, haha, I'm a trash human being, haha, I'm so worthless, woe is me, I'm going to kill myself, teehee x33333. Remarkably though, I think Gale even pulls off that terrible sense of humor well because this man is a living tactical nuke and he's very aware of that fact. Like, I'm sorry, I know it's deeply serious. I've seen the puppy dog eyes, and believe me, Gale is one of my favorite companions for just how emotionally open and vulnerable he can be when faced with these predicaments. Simultaneously though, I can't help but think that Netherese Orb Blast is absolutely hilarious because it's a spell that is functionally entirely useless. There is not a reason for it to ever be on your hotbars. Really, ever. But you know what? If you feel like it, at any given moment in a playthrough, the developers gave you the choice to press it and watch this happen. I don't know why you would choose to do this, but you can. And honestly, in multiplayer, this is just an incredible antic to pull off after any minor inconvenience. Like, there's alternatives to this, sure, but really nothing can compare to the sheer level of horror you experience when you and your friends are bantering and having fun, then something may have been said that can't be unsaid, and all of a sudden, your peripheral vision sees Gale pulling out a goddamn dagger, and you just know you done goofed. There's no way around it, you're just dead. And so is all of Baldur's Gate. And probably a lot of Faerun because that means the Absolute is running rampant. Maybe if you didn't answer feet in a deeply serious group discussion on ass versus tits, we wouldn't be in this predicament. So I had an idea. What if I gave Davey the ability to detonate their very own personal Netherese orb? So at any point in combat, they can decide to just completely ruin my day and send me all the way back to my last save, wherever or whenever that may be. Sounds pretty funny. However, I unfortunately wasn't able to get it to work. But a repercussion I only realized during this softlock is that in my attempts to give Shadow Davey this ungodly amount of power, I accidentally made them Gale? Or maybe Gale is now Shadow Davey. I don't know how, and I especially don't know why, but you'll see this in action because if I completely dismiss Shadow Davey from the campaign, the softlock will resume with Gale instead. So, of course, the solution is simple then, right? Kill Gale. Yeah, about that.
Well met. I am a magical projection of Gale of Waterdeep, and if you see this manifestation, that means I have prematurely perished. However, for reasons that cannot be disclosed, it is of vital importance that my death be remedied at your earliest convenience. You may rest assured that I do not speak out of self-preservation alone. Many lives depend on my return to the living within the span of 2 days.
I mean, in a meta sense, it's really fitting that in my attempts to nuke myself, I am forced to nuke myself, but it just isn't really a solution. The actual solution entails utilizing a console command to remove him from the game entirely just to bring him back from the depths of the abyss. But following this same solution, we actually have another problem on our hands. Fucking Shovel. I don't know how, but Shovel is in our party, and she's marked as a player character. Unlike Gale, I don't really have a potential explanation as to how or why this could have happened, as she's been dead for an extremely long time. She doesn't even have a corpse to resurrect, and I haven't done anything that could result in the game believing that Shovel is now a player character, but yeah. I guess Shovel decided that the best way to avoid being drafted is to completely softlock my game so that I could never summon her again. This is some Doki Doki shit, but what Shovel forgot to account for in this little gambit of hers is that she may be slightly harder to locate and delete compared to her anime girl counterparts, but unlike them, I hold so much more power over her very existence. All that being said though, I still have use for her, so we'll give her one opportunity to atone for her transgressions against me. Of course, that's not to say that this act of rebellion will go unchecked. Personally, I am a big fan of cruel and unusual punishment, so whenever I need to show off spells, abilities, or builds in action, she is now our dedicated target dummy. However, I am, after all, nothing but understanding, so if she continues to serve, I may even be kind enough to forgive her for her transgressions. I'm a good dad, trust me. I'm a full-time YouTube creator, and historically those have never been bad parents. Source? Just trust me. You would trust me, wouldn't you? Right? Alright. Anyways, with my save unblocked, I now have the ability to rest. So I decided to go through all of the long rest cutscenes, so we have the owlbear cub, we also have Scratch, Will is now a stunning black devil, and Lae'zel and Shadowheart are no longer attempting to kill each other. Neato. Anyways, I finally killed Grim, and now I guess it's time to finally clear out the Shattered Sanctum. Utilizing this cracked wall and entering the Sanctum from the high ground means that we could easily defeat Priestess Gut, although I did so before getting the Brand of the Absolute, which was a mistake. Dror Ragzlin was similarly defeated utilizing this high ground, and thankfully not getting King Leonidas off of it. But Minthara proved to be a problem. Well, specifically sparing Minthara proved to be a problem. So here's the game plan I eventually decided upon. Step 1, clear out the room. It's not too difficult to aggro the other enemies without pulling Minthara, so it should be pretty simple to isolate her. Step 2, respec into fighter. Obviously we can't toggle non-lethal attacks on beams of pure eldritch energy. In fact, you can't even toggle non-lethal attacks on ranged weapons, a la bows or throwing pikes, so swapping over to a melee class is extremely important. And seeing as we're level 5, which is an insanely powerful level for fighter with Action Surge, an unlockable subclass, a feat, and the ungodly ability to whack things multiple times per turn, yeah, we're gonna say it's fighting time and fight all over them. Step 3, equip some useful fighter loot that I've been collecting throughout the playthrough. Step 4, start the encounter and attempt to taunt Skellyman into casting a few spells on me. Step 5, pick a god and pray that they don't feel like using haste or action surge. Step 6, survive. Step 7, use Misty Step to whack Minthara a few times with some additional action surge action, and now with Minthara spared and the goblin leadership dismantled, let's go to the Putrid Bog. You may be curious as to why we're doing this in such a weirdly deliberate order, and the reason is because we can skip having to free Halsin if we dismantle the leadership and leave the Shattered Sanctum, which completely mitigates the possibility of our burly bear friend dying in a freak accident as mentioned earlier. Now, of course, the reason why I wanted to go to the Putrid Bog now is because I also want to tell Halsin about the Shadow Druids in the Grove, which is a thing they added in a fairly recent patch. And that addition is really important for us because dealing with them by confronting Kaga would be fucking suicide. Originally, I thought it would also be mutually assured destruction, but I don't think the druids can turn on you in combat. And after your encounter with the Shadow Druids, you can just kill all of the druids without the tieflings being blamed and caught in the crossfire. Regardless though, it's still a terrible option, and one that I just prefer to avoid. Also, in case you're curious, yeah, I probably could have gotten the note way earlier and it wouldn't impact this route at all. Like, traveling back to the Emerald Grove immediately following the Shattered Sanctum. But I wasn't certain what the parameters on Halsin's return are, so I didn't want to rush anything. And also, to state it outright, I do want to hit up most of the optional content for this video. I don't want to be a completionist and strive for 100% and completely ruin my relationship with this game, but, you know, something like a solid 80 to 85%. Especially because most Baldur's Gate 3 challenge runs on YouTube tend to go for the path of least resistance and only do what is required or beneficial to their run. Which isn't at all a knock, by the way. Like, if I had to guess, Act 3 has around 70,000 optional bosses you can fight with more than enough experience gains to theoretically level up to max several times over. So yeah, I totally understand just wanting to blast straight through it. God knows I'm not hitting up Mystic fucking Cambion in all my playthroughs, and that's without the pressure of finishing my runs ASAP lest I keel over and die in the YouTube algorithm. However, I've said this many times before, but I am a perpetual victim of inserting feature creep into my own videos, so we're gonna be going for the extra mile. So to transition back to our run, after we obtained the letter to Kaga, we went back to the Emerald Grove, invited the Tieflings to camp, talked to Halsin and crew. Halsin goes, yeah, the Shadow Druids done goofed, we should journey to Moonrise Towers together, lol, and that gave me an idea. We still have to do the Mountain Pass. Do you know what lies in front of the Mountain Pass? the Githyanki, including Kithrak Voss. I want the Silver Sword of the Astral Plane. Is it useful? No. We obviously respec back to Warlock because being a melee class right now is suicidal, and we're obviously not Gith, so some of its bonuses are pointless for us, and I'm sorry, but permanently staying in Disguise Self to access multiple racial bonuses is a min-max play that I'm just not really a fan of. However, the weapon has a shiny color, so my primordial goblin brain wants it. There's a lot of ways to acquire it early, but I debatably went for one of the worst. I busted out Shadowheart from camp, told her to command drop Kithrak Voss, saw the 12% chance to succeed, and, you know, Shadowheart is a character that is infamous in the community for never missing, and went, yeah, I like those odds. Pull the trigger, soldier. This did not work. But Shadow Davey absolutely annihilated me in combat though, so I guess we'll have another go at it. And it worked! The weapon dropped, and now all we have to do is pick it up and we're good to go. Shit. I guess we can just go without it this playthrough, as much as that hurts me to say. I mean, like I said, it's not very useful for us, and, never mind, sometimes my own talent surprises even me. And guess what? Unlike the previous two encounters, we actually survived this time, so the victory wasn't short-lived. We barely survived, mind you, like holy shit, look at Shadowheart, but we did survive, and that's all that matters. So, yeah, we just have a funny thing that we'll have in our chest for the rest of the game. Unfortunately though, it's not all good news, as in my eagerness to move on to the mountain pass following this, I totally forgot to long rest. Which means no tiefling party, which more importantly means that Karlach can no longer ride us until we see stars. As truly unfortunate as this is, life isn't about ruminating over what could have gone differently in the past. We all make mistakes. We're only human. So instead of living in the past, let's pick ourselves up and push forward towards a brighter tomorrow, starting with the mountain pass and the crash. While we're here, I think it's about time we had our dedicated loot segment, because we acquired what may be our single most important item so far. The Periapt of Wound Closure. It really shouldn't be a surprise when I say that we've been chugging health potions throughout the entire playthrough. And although I will eventually have a dedicated thief to pickpocket merchants for endless hordes of gold so I can stockpile health pots, this item is going to pay for itself dozens, if not over 100 times over. Its effect is so economical that not buying it would be a massive mistake. Even if we do hypothetically find a better amulet later on in the playthrough, it's always going to be worth stashing in our inventory to utilize outside of combat. And honestly, all of this kind of implies that the effect isn't obscenely good during combat too. Which it is. In fact, it's even better because you're limited in how many health pots you can drink per turn, which makes them even more vital. Trust me when I say that the difference may seem minimal at first glance, but I can say with absolute certainty that there have already been a fair few fights where having that effect would have turned a decisive loss into a Pyrrhic victory, which is ultimately all that matters. And it'll only get better and better as we reach higher levels and subsequently higher health pools and access to more powerful healing potions with increased ranges. Yeah, especially Act 2 and onwards, it'll be on throughout 90% of the playthrough. It's basically a best-in-slot item for us. On a slightly less powerful yet still obscenely good note though, the Blood of Lathander. Yeah, obviously we're gonna get it. I did have to do the puzzle to open up the wall containing the Dawn Master's crest, despite my best attempts to roll a nat 20 and skip it, but if you know what you're looking for, it is an exceptionally easy puzzle. So, on to the item itself. I mean, it's a legendary mace found within an optional area within an optional area with its very own optional quest. Yeah, it's gonna be pretty good. As you've undoubtedly already seen in this playthrough, Sunbeam is a pretty damn good spell to cast, especially for free. The passive effect to generate light that also blinds fiends and undead is going to be immensely valuable in the next act of the game. And a once per long rest cheat death that also heals you is going to be incredibly useful throughout the entire run. I don't think I'm going to have it on forever, especially after the cheat death procs, but it's safe to say that it will always have a place in my inventory. On the topic of weapons, I did also want to give an honorable mention to Valor Olive. I know it is an insanely OP weapon that can allow you to do nonsense like theoretically infinite damage just by walking. Simultaneously though, I have about 4 available brain cells and allocating them sounds like too much work, so I'm just sticking with my Sparky Stick. On to some other extremely valuable items for a playthrough, there's the Gloves of Dexterity. Dex saves are going to be present throughout the entire game for obvious reasons, so being able to more reliably tank them is extremely valuable. Then of course there's the other bonuses that Dexterity provides, namely additional AC and Initiative, and these gloves quickly become one of our very best tank pieces. Especially so if we choose to respec and dump our previously allocated Dex points into Constitution to maintain the Dex bonuses, all the while massively increasing our health total. So, although I don't think it's as much of a guaranteed slot as the Periapt or the Blood of Lathander, it's gonna be an immensely viable option for our character builds throughout the rest of the playthrough. Then we also have the Disintegrating Nightwalkers, which is similarly going to be a best-in-slot item for us for almost the entire playthrough. I don't know if you've noticed, but SD casts a fair few spells that leave difficult terrain. Specifically, their fondness for turning arenas into frozen hellscapes is especially prevalent. So being immune to difficult terrain is an extremely beneficial boon to have, as without hyperbole, it'll be relevant in basically every other encounter. Also, obviously, Misty Step remains to be one of the very best spells in the game for us, so being able to use it more regularly without eating away at our spell slots is always a nice bonus. And if you're curious about what we crafted in Grimforge, I decided to go for the Adamantine Splint Armor and the Adamantine Shield, both of which will be valuable items for us in the near future. Of course, defeating Grim also means we obtained the Grim Skull Helmet, although it overlaps with the Splint Armor pretty substantially, so it won't really be used. On a similar note, as I've said previously, I'm a bit of a loot hoarder. Particularly though, I've been keeping an eye out for Gloomstalker and Throzerker gear. I also discussed their viability previously, but they're both range damage dealers with immensely high DPS output, the ability to avoid or otherwise displace enemies, and access to surprisingly decent survivability options. So if we ever hit a wall that Warlock just can't handle, or we acquire a critical build-defining piece of loot, these two will be the biggest considerations for respecs. So I won't go over every item displayed here in depth, as they'll be more relevant, well, if or when they become more relevant, but just know that I've been collecting a veritable horde of items for a while now. For current Warlock gear though, we have the Haste Helm, the Protecty Sparks Wall, the Bracers of Defense, the Disintegrating Nightwalkers, the Periapt of Wound Closure, and the Spell Sparkler. If you notice the lack of rings being mentioned, that's because it's kind of a mess. We didn't get either of our best rings, so we're kind of just wearing whatever right now. The only truly viable ring for us currently is the Whispering Promise, but I completely forgot that its effect procs with potions and other miscellaneous self-regeneration effects, so I never wore it. Whoopsie daisy. I mean, there is also the Sparks Wall, which is actually a decent flex option, particularly with how fond low-tier God is of lightning bolt spam. I'm not sure if I would call it a great ring, though. Undoubtedly really good, but unless we're fighting an enemy that is similarly fond of electrocuting us to death, where this obviously becomes an extremely strong pick, I'd probably place it at a situational B-. That's about it, though. The only other thing worth mentioning is that we do have a ton of spell effects accessed by items that will occasionally be equipped and unequipped, but even in the dedicated loot segment, I don't think it's worth mentioning any of them individually. Some of them were used way more than others, but I don't think I need to prolong this segment with exciting commentary, like sometimes casting Magic Missile can be good. Like, it's true. That's about it, though. So, I think that's all the notable stuff for now, so let's actually talk about the crash itself. Honestly, outside of the acquisition of gear, the only notable decision I made was taking the incredibly bold risk of attempting all the Zathis checks so that I can use Illithid powers as bonus actions instead of regular actions, which did surprisingly pay off for us. I entered with only one inspiration and was forced to use it on the semi-final check. But fortunately our last roll was a critical success, so things are looking pretty good for our boy. So of course following this success, we had to kill the lady so we could steal her parasites, which I promise isn't an innuendo. And on a similar note, I also stole an egg that I'm keeping for myself because I really don't want to fight that dude in Act 3. Plus, I'm pretty sure he kills Ameluum, which would be really sad. And it's also probably a convenient time to mention that I am now committing genocide throughout the entire crash. If I had a quarter for every optional area in Act 1 that I systematically massacre an entire race's population out of in every playthrough because they're evil assholes, you can auto-fill in the rest of the joke. Also, before some of you comment, yeah, I really like Lae'zel's character. I think she's cool, and I love seeing her develop throughout the course of the story. If you think that her making cute puppy dog eyes in some cutscenes means that the Githyanki found here are completely rational, you should seek psychiatric assistance at the soonest possible convenience. I know that she was indoctrinated into following a tyrannical god's orders, but that just doesn't mean that her actions shouldn't be morally reprimanded or excused.
Bug? Kill her. Yeah, Carve screams from her flesh.
Anyways, while I'm here expressing how I'm just the pinnacle of morality, genocide proved to be pretty tough, actually. This was easily the most difficult area we've been in so far, and I can say this with confidence, nothing will come close to it in difficulty for a while. Not only are the Gith in exceptional positions to mitigate AoE damage, which incentivizes Shadow to target me way more often, but they also have a wide array of different combat strategies, with almost all of them also having Misty Step, which means that my attempts to disengage are almost always in vain. Unlike a lot of the later Act 1 and even most of the Act 2 content, the crush required me to bust out all the stops just to survive. There was frequent use of Misty Step and Fly, lots of consumables, lots of gear swapping to access different spells or effects which can get us through particularly difficult encounters, utilizing different summons to draw aggro, Lots of different tactics to aggro enemies, so in a better position to flee when combat starts. Hell, this room right here was so ruthless in particular that I decided to use invisibility just to escape the encounter. It's almost like we invaded a fortified stronghold that an exceptionally strong and ruthless militant race commandeered for their god-given task. I am truly shocked that things weren't a complete cakewalk. But after all is said and done, after countless deaths spanning the course of nearly 2 hours, we completely eradicated the Crash's inhabitants, defied Vlaakith, acquired all sorts of powerful items including the Blood of Lathander, and hit level 7. Hip hip, hooray. So following all this, with level 7 having access to 4-3 multi-class builds that can outperform pure single-class builds, I decided to spend an hour attempting to cook, and instead of emerging from the hypothetical kitchen with anything edible, I burned the entire house down. The main concept was throwing the Silver Sword of the Astral Plane at idiots as a disguised Githyanki Eldritch Knight Throw-Zerker, and literally nothing about this worked. At all. It was an objective downgrade from my previous loadout in every sense of the imagination. But I hope that you can at least admire the sheer amount of gall required to think that anything about this could ever work. Afterwards, I did decide to do an actual respec that wasn't completely autistic though. Specifically starting off as a fighter and multi-classing back into Warlock for heavy armor proficiency and shield proficiency, as well as an extra AC. I also decided to get an additional level into Fighter for Action Surge, which is going to be really good for getting us out of tough situations. Especially so since it recharges on short rest, which we really enjoy as a Warlock. Of course we did all this so that we can finally utilize the gear we obtained from Grimm, and just look at this doofus. I love him. He looks like a socially awkward fat kid in elementary school waddling up to you asking if you have games on your phone. You just have to root for the guy, come on. Anyways, I did also mess around with a few things for Warlock during the respec. Specifically, I went for Pact of the Tome, as the summons were helpful, but were functionally replaceable by Minor Illusion. In fact, I'd actually argue that Minor Illusion is just strictly better, as it also draws in enemies without having to initiate combat. All of this isn't to say that summons aren't incredibly helpful, but I don't think that Pact of the Chain is really what we want here. Especially since it overlaps with Shovel, and we aren't getting enough mileage out of Find Familiar becoming a ritual to really care about it. The main reason I wanted to go for Pact of the Tome, though, was specifically for on-demand guidance. I know I could just cast it outside of combat with a silver pendant, but I haven't played this game enough to know where every potentially important check is, and obviously we'd have to spend an action re-equipping our Periapt if something does fail, so it just isn't ideal. Basically, I want to prioritize safety in a run where choices can be permanent, and the other spells are a pretty decent plus. Also, for my level 5 Eldritch Incantation, I decided to go for Fiendish Vigor, as it's actually a pretty insane source of healing that I should have taken way earlier. I've already mentioned just how good temporary HP is, so having a temporary HP effect with 100% uptime is incredible. Plus, it has a very potent synergy with the Periapt, since I can get temporary HP and heal in the same turn, which is a fantastic combo and one that I'll be using constantly. Also, to say it outright, before this we had the Mage Armor incantation, but not only are we using real armor now, which makes it irrelevant, but if we ever go back to robes, we can just get Mage Armor from one of our camp buffers, so that pick was redundant in the first place. All in all, nothing was lost and a whole lot was gained. So with that all out of the way, in case you're wondering, since this was a substantial level for us, once we get to the Shadow Cursed Lands, Fittingly enough, Shadow Davey is going to get yet another buff. One that is really, really fun. You'll see what I mean in just a second though, as we're going to go ahead and wrap up all the threads in Act 1. We killed Bual, we found Balin, and judging by this pop-up that says complete, save Mayrina, I think it's safe to say that she got out of this encounter with the hag completely okay. And Auntie miraculously didn't instantaneously perish, which allowed us to get an extra ability score. Which of course will be going into Charisma because Eldritch Blast and speech checks go brrrr, and yeah. I think that's more or less everything in Act 1 done. So, after we speak with Elminster and Gale does his little puppy dog eye routine, it's finally time we departed for the Shadow-Cursed Lands. Yeah, I know we've been going through this content at a blistering speed, but you just have to stick with me. So, remember that segment from way earlier where I wanted to have Gale at home nuke me constantly? So, I couldn't get the orb to work, but I did find an alternative. Yep. At a randomly predetermined time between 15 to 75 minutes, I will be forced to immediately self-destruct and lose all of my progress since my last save, including outside of combat. Happy days. Also, I have to give a special shout out to this fellow right here who helped me figure out how to pull off this little maneuver. I attempted to send over 10 funbucks to their Steam account for helping me out, but my attempts at diplomacy were refused, so instead, I'm going to highlight their Nexus Mods projects, which includes, but is not limited to, Real-Time Turns, badly translated Baldur's Gate 3, which also includes TTS, but most importantly, Power Word Metal Pipes. Someone out there is going to beat all of Baldur's Gate 3 with this, and to be perfectly clear, it's not going to be me, but I know it will happen. So if you feel inclined to check out any of these masterpieces, a link will be in the description, as well as a Google document containing all of the mods used for this playthrough. Woot woot. Also, to indirectly buff Shadow Davey, we're going to be multiplying the HP of all enemies. At this point in the game, I'm actually capable of dishing out some decent damage, so of course this will not only mean that my character can't end fights as efficiently, but now I'm also more than twice as likely to be blasted straight to hell. And I'll be honest, I think I went through Act 1 relatively unscathed. There are some close calls, sure, but overall, I'd wager that things went pretty good for us. That is going to change very, very quickly. The first thing I did upon entering the Shadow-Cursed Lands was immediately full buff, and despite having 77 health and tons of resistances, Karnus ended up being a roadblock to say the least. Our first encounter, I wanted to see what would happen if I just selected the leave option for shits and giggles. If you could believe it, he didn't take that very well, so of course, we pretty much immediately died. Who could have guessed? So I ran it back. We're going to go ahead and accept an escort to Moonrise, but I know there's an ambush waiting for us here, so I'm just going to go ahead and Eldritch Blast him past the ambush point, and... Ah, I see. This makes the Harpers hostile, and Karnus remains to be on our side. Wonderful. Yeah, I don't know what else I expected. I mean, I'm trying to kill Karnus, they're trying to kill Karnus, and it's as they say. The enemy of my enemy is also my fucking enemy. So, yeah, that attempt also perished very quickly, and this is where I made a horrific discovery. The Blood of Lathander isn't working. I haven't procced the effect yet, it's just not activating. that does not bode well for this encounter, especially since her quick save is right here, just before it starts. Fantastic. So that's my second attempt down the drain. Third attempt, same result as the last. Fourth attempt, the Shadow Curse got me, but again, there's no cheat deaths, so this was just a reload. By the time we started our fifth attempt, it was time for a new game plan. Fly the fuck away from everyone, but making sure to start the fight against the Harpers before flying too far away. Because at this point, honestly killing them is doing Jaheira a favor. And this plan actually went really well. We did have a stray Harper chase after us, but utilizing Repelling Blast and pushing them towards Shadow Davey's location meant that they could do enough damage to finish them off with ease. Then it was just a 1v1 between them and Katniss, which obviously went in SD's favor. What happened next is so completely predictable that I practically knew it was going to happen over half an hour in advance, and yet it still caught me by surprise.
These Fey creatures are infamous for their trickery, sometimes playful.
It's okay, it's fine. 6 tries to charm, right? I've only been in the Shadow Cursed Lands for an hour, and I haven't even gotten past the first real encounter. I'm having fun, I swear. Alright, well, fortunately, the 7th attempt ended up being pretty successful. Although Karnus did eventually aggro onto me, which resulted in this goofy, Looney Tunes-ass chase sequence. Of course we couldn't just outrun him forever, and for all intents and purposes, he has a permanent sanctuary effect until he hits me, and if he hits me, I'm probably just dead. So, although he was extremely low, I did have to use a very valuable Call Lightning spell from Pact of the Tome, as well as Action Surge in order to cast it again to end the fight. Of course we're going to short rest after this, but it was still a pretty rough endeavor. And fortunately we managed to get past the damn pixie dialogue without imploding, so the Shadow Curse is effectively remedied and we can proceed to Last Light In. Actually, on that note, I have to be a little bit meta here and say that a lot of explosions will be happening in conversation because I'm trying to let dialogue play out completely so that it looks natural in the video and not just the typical ha 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 I mashed the spacebar 8 billion times gameplay you would probably expect. Which does make video editing a whole lot easier for me, and it's probably cool for those of you who can't read this, but it also incites a little bit of existential dread in me whenever I'm just trying to quick save and the threat of getting nuked from orbit and losing everything is always looming above me. I don't want to enforce a strict ruling like I can only reload to automatic saves or I can only save within these parameters because that would just force me to rush through everything, which was never the intention of the video, as you could probably tell. But I don't want the new factor to just be relegated to me making 18 trillion quick saves. But whenever possible, I'm only going to save outside of combat and outside of conversation. So anyways, moving on to Last Light In, I ran into a predicament. I am broke. I also exploded, but my poverty poses more of a long-term threat. So, of course, this can only mean one thing for us. Yeah, as it turns out, pickpocketing is pretty OP. Although, for the time being, we only bought 2 items that are worth implementing into our build. Of course, that isn't to say that I didn't buy several stellar items for alternative classes or playstyles. Gloomstalker in particular just begins to pop off in Act 2, but the only 2 items I really wanted for the time being were the Cloak of Protection because it's a cloak, and a really good one at that, and the Darkfire shortbow for haste, and a really nice resistance to cold and fire. Actually, on that note, with this item's acquisition, I think I have a pretty solid tank build going on. Admittedly, it's tank in air quotes, sure, but with aid, I have a pretty solid health pool, and I have resistances to poison, fire, ice, and lightning. Which means that out of all of Shadow Davey's spells, the only 2 damage types that aren't currently resisted are Radiant and Necrotic. And to be totally fair, that Sunbeam damage is no joke, but I find that Circle of Death is actually pretty far down the AoE priority list. So admittedly, it's not the biggest concern for us. Hell, even assuming it were to become a massive problem, we do have access to a condition that allows us to resist necrotic damage until long rest that's not too far out of the way, so we have options available in case of the worst. So altogether with our resistances, stockpiles of health potions, periactive wound closure, camp buffs, reduced damage taken from spells, false life, and our mobility tools, I think we're doing pretty well for ourselves. This theory was almost immediately put to the test in Moonrise Towers, as we're going to go ahead and clear it out now instead of during the big confrontation at the end of the act. There's a few reasons as to why. Firstly, and most glaringly, is the fact that not doing so is going to all but guarantee Jaheira and the Harper's deaths. But secondly, and maybe a bit more controversially, I genuinely don't know, I believe it's significantly easier to do it this way. Not just in this playthrough, but in any playthrough. Not only is Moonrise segmented in a way that allows you to pick off tiny groups of enemies without risk of the entire tower aggroing onto you, but even if it was more open, the guards don't really move around much, and if they do, they seem extremely reluctant to ever pin the blame on a fellow true soul. In fact, their sheer level of negligence actually proved to be a massive deficit in this run, since I wanted to start encounters in a position to avoid incoming fire, and I was hardly able to pull more than a few enemies at once just because they're so oblivious. Which means I had to frequently go out of hiding just to pull more enemies, which often left me in a very vulnerable state. And this level of negligence even applies to the scarier enemies found in the area. For example, you can just isolate Zarel in these quarters and gank her 4v1 with no complications. The Warden can also meet the exact same fate, and if you pass a check, Ketheric's Warhound won't even put up any resistance while you beat it to death. Again, with just how imposing this area is built up to be, you would expect clearing it out with your ragtag group of adventurers to be some Metal Gear Solid bullshit, with efficient and methodical stealth tactics being all but required, but really it's an experience more akin to Sneak King, if anything. So, yeah, this on its own would be fantastic, but another crucial thing to note here is that there are just so many positions you can utilize that make the already segmented combat encounters a complete breeze. For example, this is an unedited screenshot of my Honor Mode playthrough. I'm not even kidding, I was in such a fuck it we ball aura at this point in the playthrough that all of this was the end result of a failed pickpocket attempt. Hence why Lae'zel was very, very far away from the action. But after being caught, I decided to bring in Karlach and Shadowheart, and as you can clearly see, this was actually a disaster scenario, with a scrying eye escaping from combat and rallying most of the tower to me. But as you can also clearly see, we built our warpath with corpses and our health pools were barely scratched. And this wasn't a party that utilized AoE. Really at all. I think I may have used a few arrows here and there, but that was about it. So if you bring in a wizard, or a sorcerer, or a warlock into the fray to cast Hunger of Hadar, Spike Growth, Wall of Fire, or really any semi-decent AoE spell that lasts several turns, and you pretty much just win. Good job. I'd legitimately recommend trying it in your next playthrough if you haven't already. It's pretty fun, and it makes the climactic charge into the tower kind of hilarious if you decide to keep only 1 or 2 idiots alive. Of course, in this playthrough, we're going to completely exterminate everyone in the tower, because even a single enemy surviving could very realistically result in all of our allies perishing, so we have to be extremely thorough. But yeah, after all was said and done, Moonrise was hardly a challenge. Don't get me wrong, it took me a few hours. Despite my best efforts to be as painfully unsubtle as possible, the guards here are just so hopelessly oblivious that I couldn't reliably aggro more than 3 to 5 enemies into any given encounter. And there was the occasional hiccup here and there, like Shadow Davey, King Leonidas 300ing me, or the Warden utilizing an infinite number of invisibility potions because I figured out way too late into this campaign that some of the enemies also benefit from some of the mods I used, but on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being Grimforge and 10 being the Crush, I'd say Moonrise is probably about a solid 2.5. Anything higher than a 3 would actually be disingenuous. Oh yeah, I should also note here that we did rescue Minthara before starting the massacre, so the wifey wasn't at risk of getting caught in the crossfire.
I am
for the most part.
To destroy all the...
So following yet another cleansing, it's time for another respec. As rescuing all the tieflings and Iron Hand gnomes lets us acquire the Potent Robe, which is easily the single most class-defining item we've received so far. For starters, it makes our Eldritch Blasts even more terrifying, which is always a valuable prospect for us. But more importantly, I actually think it outvalues the defensive abilities of the Adamantine Splint Armor. I know we already have sources of temporary HP, and don't get me wrong, we're still going to be utilizing False Life and Shield of Thralls, but here's the thing. Shadow's initiative is so comically high that they are guaranteed to go first in any encounter, which of course will carry over to all future rounds. So since our turn will always be after Shadow's turn, it's extremely likely that the temporary HP we enter combat with will be extinguished. Which is where the Potent Robe literally provides us a new lease on life. Immediately restoring +5 temporary HP every single round with no drawbacks is so powerful that it's not completely inaccurate to claim it essentially gives us an action point, as we were already spamming False Life whenever our temporary HP was depleted. In fact, it's actually way better than that since we only have 1 action. So equipping this more or less lets us acquire our action point, which is kinda sad to admit, but it's good. And, it sure would help if that newfound action point could be spent, blasting. Yeah. Hell, even in terms of AC, it's obviously lower than the Adamantine Splint Armor, but Mage Armor plus our Dexterity bonus means we aren't exactly slouching on that front either. So, yeah, it's really, really good, and all in all, with this new powerhouse of an item and the fact that we just hit level 8, we're going to go ahead and ditch the Fighter multiclass and go pure Warlock for yet another feat and Eldritch Incantation. Actually, let's ignore that for about, 30 seconds, because I made a very reverse decision that I'll explain in just a minute, but real quick, we're gonna go ahead and intimidate a bitch so threateningly that they instantly commit suicide.
The gold is not for me. The gold is for the toll. I collect the toll. I collect the gold. But gold! Gold! You must pay. No. I pay it back.
I'm not even going to lie, I entirely forgot about this, and I actually just busted out laughing, because the video editor in me wanted to do this dramatic camera pan into the safe, and it's just 1 gold. Thank you, Baldur Gate. Anyways, we're going to kill the next Thorm with even more yapping. But before attempting to kill the 3rd Thorm with yet even more yapping, we're finally going to respec like I mentioned earlier. Yeah, I scripted this shortly after the play session, and I genuinely thought I did this before the 1st Thorm because I deliberately took the actor feat specifically to yap people to death more easily while also capping out our charisma. But apparently I just forgot to until now. I mean, to be totally fair, it didn't change the outcome at all, but ultimately it was still a very dumb blunder on my end. But to talk about the new levels in Warlock, I already mentioned that I took the actor feat for yet even more brrrr with Eldritch Blast. But for spells, I took Hunger of Hadar and Hentai for AoE nonsense, and Counterspell for, surprisingly enough, countering spells, and for my 4th Eldritch Incantation, I decided to take the Book of Ancient Secrets as, again, we already have access to most of the other options, and or they require a Warlock spell slot to cast, both of which I'm just not a big fan of. Of course, levels 1 through 5 were more or less the exact same as our previous build. So with that out of the way, we can move on to the next Thorm, whose epitaph is going to be the same as his now deceased relatives. Death by abundant amounts of yapping. Oh shit. Well, fortunately for us, we always have access to our one last all-or-nothing gambit. One final move passed down by the Gunface family, and it worked out like a charm. Although, if I'm being honest, I was never concerned with this fight in the first place because Malice's AI heavily prioritizes resurrecting fallen sisters, which you can easily just nuke down again to stunlock him into a Sisyphean hell. But it did deserve to be mentioned that I done goofed. Again. Hell, maybe respecking was the original goof. If I just stayed as this little idiot man, maybe Malice wouldn't attempt to murder me. It's a distinct possibility. So, actually remarkably on topic, but after that incident, we have to travel to the Gauntlet of Shar, and let me tell you, this room, right here, was the first time in the entire playthrough where I thoroughly believed that an entire respec may be necessary to proceed. As in, completely abandoning Warlock for an entirely different class and build altogether. The problem here is I can't target these Umbral Tremors with magic, and if left alone, a small army of Dark Justiciars, including a badass Justiciar Crusader, will emerge from them to steal your Squishmallows and overall ruin your day. That in of itself isn't necessarily the problem though, because in theory, Shadow Davey could totally take them on, 1v100, but for some reason, the AI gets really confused when there's this many enemies around, and it just leads to them ending turns without accomplishing anything. Which I'd say is suboptimal. That and this entire encounter takes about 3 to 5 business days. This is the first encounter of the game where the Netherese Orb at home is a legitimate factor to consider in our combat strategy, because if I don't intervene, the fight's just gonna last forever. And add to that stress, I got to this point 20 minutes into the counter, meaning that at any given moment, I could just explode and have to reset. I'm having fun. I promise, I'm not stressed, I'm not anxious, why would I be anxious? Anyways, in case of a disaster scenario, my plan was to go for a Click Gloomstalker respec, since I do have a full build available for it, and as mentioned previously, it does begin to pop off in Act 2. For some reason though, the nuke timer was extremely generous to us in the Gauntlet of Shar specifically. You'll see what I mean during a later segment, but SD was eventually able to overcome the tidal wave of Justiciars despite the clock ticking well over an hour at this point, and we were able to save before inevitably exploding just 2 minutes later. I've been making comments like joy to the world and happy times all around in a, sarcastic tone this entire video, but for once, sincerely, happy times all around. Anyways, following this, we're going to be killing Balthazar here to prevent an upcoming confrontation that could result in heartbreak and tragedy. Fortunately though, this was a much simpler endeavor with all the enemies conglomerating into one compact room with its escape barred off with enough ice to make Frostpunk 3. But after we defeated the Necromancer, we're at a bit of a strange crossroads for the chapter now. The Shadow-Cursed Lands doesn't really have much in the name of side quests. There's a ton of optional areas and encounters, sure, but when it comes to questing, Act 2 is pretty linear. Especially when compared to Act 1, or God forbid, Act 3. And stated outright, this isn't a critique. The side quests available tend to be very well developed, they're usually integrated into the main storyline nicely, and narratively it makes sense for the act to be more focused. It'd be fucking insanity if you traversed into this dead, decrepit, hostile land and you just immediately got hit with Rivington levels of stimuli overload. But the linearity still deserves to be mentioned for the video. So, what all is there to do here? Well, one thing we're just going to get out of the way. We're not going to be talking to Isabel. Ever. If you want to see how that turns out, it's rather suboptimal. Fortunately, we don't have to talk to her for protection against a shadow curse as we rescued the pixie from Katniss, as discussed earlier, and likewise we don't have to talk to her to cure Art, so this is an acceptable compromise. But speaking of Art, waking him is a requirement to lifting the Shadow Curse, and really that entire questline is going to require a lot of planning before initiating. Unless you're a dumbass like me and decide, you know what, I think this might actually be okay since the shadows tend to be grouped up, which means they're heavily prioritized for AoE. And to be totally fair, I was correct. The first attempt was nearly perfect, and that was with tons of fuck-ups. The second attempt, though... Remember what I said about Shadow Davey getting overstimulated and doing nothing whenever there's a lot of enemies nearby? Well, fuck. That's unfortunate. Look, there was eventually going to be a hitch in this playthrough, and although I can now say with hindsight there are a lot more to come, I'm pretty surprised we got this far before really encountering one. You could definitely say that I should reload here since this is obviously not an intended behavior, but... I don't know, suffering builds character, and God knows this land has some damn characters in it, so... yeah. Sorry, Papa Bear. So, alright, with that entire critical side quest now becoming literally impossible to finish, there's only really one path forward, and that's the Gauntlet of Shar. So I went ahead and busted out Shadowheart and Asterion from retirement for some companion-specific encounters and dialogue, went ahead and killed Yurgir with minimal complications, hit level 9 and got this really cool rock, and went back to camp just to realize that Minthara didn't particularly like me for some reason, so I decided to give her my Silver Sword of the Astral Plane for financial compensation. I think she pulled a Stardew Valley and ate it, because she obviously accepted it and stashed it away in her inventory, but later on it just disappeared from the game, never to be seen again. I'd be lying to you if I said it'd be critical to our run and that it's going to be sorely missed, but I miss it. It was a legendary weapon. It looked kinda cool. Look, I'm in an emotional time in my life right now. I don't need to justify my feelings to you. Good night, sweet prince. I'll remember you always. So after that tragedy, I eventually decided to try a few of the trials, but I figured the soft step trial would be more or less undoable with Shadow Davey trailing us, and honestly, fuck this trial in particular. Like, I know it's not a difficult trial. I'm pretty sure I solved it on my first attempt in my blind playthrough, and I know there's tons of ways to cheese it, but I still find the fail state being instantaneous death incredibly nerve-wracking and honestly, kind of annoying. So, seeing as I already had 2 of the orbs, I decided to bust out Gale for a few seconds to use Knock to skip past the gauntlet. Shadowheart was not a fan of this. More specifically, she wasn't a fan of us not finding the legendary spear. Like, she literally says, "Hey idiot, let's go back to find that legendary weapon I need for my goddess's will, lol," but for some reason I figured we could just avoid doing that, and yeah, no, this was a stupidly obvious outcome. However, unlike Halsin from earlier, divine intervention. Look, I swear to God, I didn't plan for this to happen. Firstly, if I were to make the executive decision to cheese the system, I'd get my bear back. I like Shadowheart, but bear. And secondly, to be totally clear, the thing that dictates whether or not I explode is a timer I keep on another monitor, which went off at about 22 minutes, so this wasn't exceptionally likely. I also have to say that I really wasn't a fan of having to backtrack either. My last save was probably a solid half hour ago, but this is the game and I'm stuck playing it, so here we are. Actually, speaking of which, it's a good time to mention this side quest. Remember when I said that the side quests available here tend to be well developed? Yeah, I said tend to because I just don't really care about this dude. He strikes me as the type of guy who spends all day refreshing r/am_I_the_asshole by new to comment on every single post. Not just that, but he also owns 47 alternative accounts, each with their own fake identities, so it can spew hateful bullshit behind a mask that nobody falls for because it's pretty obvious when he opens up with shit like, YTA, equal lefts, equal rights. As a right-wing homosexual African-American female, I should be able to massacre children on the streets. This is woke pander. The reward isn't even worth it either, but I begrudgingly went through this quest just for the sake of saying that I did it. Firstly, problem. I launched yet another crusade to rob every merchant in Faerun. Again, and somewhere along the way I sold my bell, which means that I no longer have protection from the Shadow Curse. Shadow Davey wasn't a particularly big fan of that.
Find the ledger and bring it to me.
So in order to finish the quest, we had to go ahead and put our guy down. Which was surprisingly easy, considering that they didn't seem fond of using spells for whatever reason. But the series of unfortunate events was before the Shadowheart explosion, so all of this was ultimately irrelevant because I had to reload all the way back here, before I even met the guy on the other side of the fucking zone. Fantastic. Second attempt, I perish. But guess what? Since I'm a professional dumbass, I didn't save when I finally got back to him, so we're all the way back here again. Third attempt, I forgot where the hell I was even supposed to go and died because I ran straight into this nightmare hellscape. But finally, on the fourth attempt, everything went as planned. Without any explosions and without any premature companion deaths. Which means that we can finally get back to the Gauntlet of Shar. Anyways, now that we're finally back here, we're just gonna go through some of these trials. I'm totally aware that this isn't completely necessary, and we could just grab the spear, but if we're here, we may as well go the extra mile. Of course, afterwards, we went ahead and proceeded past the point of no return, and fortunately, since we killed Balthazar, there is no confrontation before the Night Song. And since we're just such a charismatic fella, we can convince Shadowheart to abandon Shar and let the Night Song live. Which will then kick off the assault on Moonrise Tower that we've already cleared out, so we're immediately ready to confront General Ketheric Thorm. And, I won't lie, these boss fights are actually pathetically easy if you free Dame Aelin. I'm not saying this to be hyperbolic, but with minimal support, she can and will destroy Ketheric in the Avatar of Myrkul all by herself, as she's functionally invincible. In fact, in speedruns, if you're not going for the meta strats of jumping on the Avatar of Myrkul as an invisible bear or throwing a comical amount of fireworks at him, the most efficient way to play through this fight is to rescue her and promptly hide in a corner while she girl bosses the Avatar of Death. I mean, you could argue that this is a cheese, but to be frank, I've never been the protagonist in this run, so honestly I feel like it's perfectly par for the course. Honestly though, all of this may as well be worthless filler side quest nonsense to me because, guess what? We got our son! He's back! Little buddy! It's him! I mean, we also got advantage on intelligence saves, and Zevor and Mizora are doing their own thing, and Jaheira is lounging about outside of the boss arena eating Cheetos, so she isn't in mortal peril, but I don't fucking care about any of this. We got us. It's my favorite little kitten, which says a whole lot because I'm a YouTube creator. Anyways, this happiness is going to very quickly fade, because remember what I said about Dame Aelin 1v1ing the Avatar of Myrkul? Yeah, that strat usually works. It's a little bit less effective when the Avatar of Myrkul has 500 HP and generates another 60 to 200 worth of trash every turn. And of course, that trash can heal the Avatar of Myrkul, and may I remind you, there's a ticking time bomb here. This was not ideal. So, yeah, I was stuck here for about 2 hours. The strategy didn't really change much in those 2 hours because it really couldn't change much. We were stuck in here as a warlock, with no possibility of respecking, and frankly things looked pretty dire because I just don't have the survivability to withstand so many attacks while simultaneously dealing with so much trash every round. That was until I exploded, and yet again, divine intervention. What the fuck is this? I don't know, but you know what? A lesser man wouldn't take this opportunity. A lesser man would realize that this was a disappointing way to finish the climax of a chapter and reset the fight just to perish over and over again. A lesser man would see life give them lemons, and instead of making lemonade, he'd squeeze the juices directly into his eyes while maniacally screaming that the pain isn't excruciating enough and life should have given them razor blades instead. I am a lesser man. Get me the fuck out of here, power lesbian. Anyways, with that absolutely intense showdown dealt with, we can chat with some of our friends and move on to Baldur's Gate. Is what I would really like to say, but we have a bit of a problem. Shadow Davey isn't with us anymore. Initially, I thought this was in correlation with the Merkle nonsense from earlier, but after exiting the game for a while and loading back in, nah, still not there. Fortunately though, this issue resolved itself after, I'd wager 20 odd minutes of reloads and chicanery. I couldn't tell you what happened to make them reappear, but I'm not complaining. But afterwards, a new problem took its place. One that is far, far more sinister. It appears that Shadow is in allegiance with the Gith. Sorta. You'll see what I mean in just a second, but I didn't feel like taking yet another undeserved victory, so I had to figure out how in the cinnamon toast fuck I get the Gith Yankee to realize that the skeleton is a spy. So during my attempts to get this issue resolved, here's what I discovered. If we cast spells on him, that's totally fine. In fact, the Gith seem to be totally cool standing in Chernobyl clouds until their lungs collapse and their skin corrodes into toxic waste, which is pretty helpful. Still completely invalidates the encounter, though. So what about attacking them with a weapon, or maybe even a summon? Well, apparently the Gith are also totally fine with getting bludgeoned to death, so that isn't going to work. In fact, on that note, killing the Gith doesn't even aggro the Gith. They're just totally cool with being massacred despite my best attempts to be the worst double agent in history. But after about 30 minutes of trial and error, my thoughts were becoming philosophical in nature. Who are we fighting? What are they fighting for? Hell, what are we fighting for? What does it mean to be Gith? Alright, as we've seen, the Gith Yankee are totally happy to die for a cause that they deem just. After all, to quote Gilbert Keith Chesterton, a true soldier fights not because he hates what is in front of him, but because he loves what is behind him. The problem is that the Gith hate what is in front of them and loves what is behind them, so they're fucking unbeatable. And this is where I have to delve into psychology. Basophobia is the fear of falling. But unlike every other phobia that is believed to be learned or developed throughout your life, save the fear of loud noises, it is widely believed to be an innate fear that is hardwired not just into every human brain, but a wide variety of brains found all across the animal kingdom. And I know what you're probably thinking to yourself. This is a cool story and all, Socrates, but what the fuck are you on about? So, here's my theory. I do not care that these idiots are from outer space, and it's likely that their gravity is lesser than that found on our Earth, or in the case of Baldur's Gate 3, Azeroth. If the fear of falling is literally ingrained into every human brain at birth, then I'm gonna hypothesize that the fear of falling is also prevalent in all the humanoid races in D&D. I mean, after all, you have to remember, shoving foes into chasms may kill them instantly. All this in mind, my theory is that if we give the Gith Yankee a playful push, their bodies will surge with adrenaline, and their biological instincts will override their determination to serve their God Queen, and they'll finally attack us. So, without further ado, get shoved, idiot. I honestly just don't know anymore. I just knew very early on into this playthrough that it's going to make me emotionally and mentally numb, so I just stopped questioning things, but somehow it keeps surprising me with its sheer depravity. And guess what, fuckaroo? It's about to get even worse because we finally made it to Baldur's Gate 3, which means I can do this. it's time to get angry. With a little bit of exploration and shopping, we now have access to a fairly high-end Berserker build, and to be honest, we aren't even max level, and we still have a fair few best-in-slot items to obtain, but we are a fucking monster. Too much of a monster. Like, we're actually killing Steel Watchers in one turn, and that's with the health buff. And I mean, if this was a glass cannon build, or one that relied on long resting, that would totally be fine, but no. Our health pool has never been healthier, we have access to more healing than ever before with better potions and access to more actions and bonus actions. Our AC is the highest it's ever been, we've received a buff to all of our saving throws, and we have access to a permanent bless effect. All of this, and keep in mind that a good way to mitigate damage is to just kill all of your enemies before they can damage you. And our damage potential is higher than ever before, so yeah. Game's fucked. So what I decided to do here was buff enemy HP by 200%, effectively tripling the health of everything in the game, gave every enemy lethal AI, as well as enhancing their spells and abilities, and this was not a good idea. I decided the first place I should go to after buffing the game by a ludicrous amount was, naturally, Raphael's House of Hope. If you're curious as to why I immediately embarked on a suicide mission after I made the game considerably more difficult, the motivation was actually fairly simple, even if extremely stupid. So currently I'm min-maxing my build by utterly nuking my strength all the way down to the bare minimum of 8, but by utilizing elixirs of Cloud Giant strength, not only do I get to ignore that weakness and gain all of the benefits from having a comically high 27 strength, but I also get to free up all of the points that would previously be allocated into strength into other helpful attributes like dexterity or constitution. However, we can min-max this even further by equipping an item that raises our stats to a specific level. For example, even after all of this time, the Gloves of Dexterity remains to be a viable build option for us. However, with so many incredible gloves becoming available in Act 3, like the Legacy of the Masters, Helldust Gloves, or even the Gauntlets of Hill Giant Strength, the competition is pretty fierce. Plus, it only raises our dexterity up to 18, which is good, but it's not quite as absurd as, say, hypothetically, raising our constitution up to 23. Yeah, the Amulet of Greater Health is definitely our best option for this. I originally included other options in this segment, but I can't even entertain the idea of using the Warped Headband of Intellect over the Amulet of Greater fucking Health. That would be insanity. So to hype up the Amulet a bit, Constitution has historically been one of our very best abilities, so raising it up to 23 will not only be extremely valuable in of itself, but it'll also free up the most points out of any attribute. And in regards to its equipment slot, as much as I adore my Periaptive Wound Closure, I wouldn't really consider the Amulet of Greater Health a strictly better item for this challenge, but they both serve as necklaces that enhance survivability, so I view the two as two totally distinct yet viable options. So, all in all, if we obtain the Amulet of Greater Health, that'll give us 27 points in total to spend across only 4 attributes. 30 if you want to go ahead and count bonuses, so yeah, I'd say overall, going out of our way to get it would be a pretty respectable endeavor. The problem, of course, is that the Amulet of Greater Health is in the House of Hope. And if you retrieve it, you are forced to confront Raphael, which I'd say is rather suboptimal. But if we're gonna go through hell, we may as well make the most of it, so not only did we retrieve the Amulet of Greater Health, but we also retrieved the Gauntlets of Hill Giant Strength, the Orphic Hammer, Helldust Gloves, Helldust Helmet, Burnished Ring, and the Titular Hope. Of course, all this shenaniganizing made Raphael very, very unhappy. And I can now say with a fair amount of confidence that the challenge as it currently stands is now effectively over. Not because I couldn't defeat this encounter, which has a combined total of nearly 4,000 HP and comical damage potential, but because Shadow Davey now dies pretty much instantaneously, and I'm virtually invincible because shockingly a hyper-lethal ranged build with a fuck ton of mobility, survivability tools, health, and healing is kind of difficult to take down. All the Cambions died with very basic kiting. I mean, once they started chasing me, they really couldn't hope to inflict even a single point of damage onto me, but for Raphael, I figured out two key weaknesses here that made him a complete joke. Firstly, I don't believe he can detect invisible characters, and if he can, he seems very reluctant to because I just haven't seen him do it. This means that Yurgir would eventually end the fight all on his own, but I'm rather impatient, so the most powerful sentence of Baldur's Gate 3 echoed in my mind like God himself was sending me a divine revelation.
Shoving foes into chasms may kill them instantly, but could cost you precious loot.
Down comes the claw, motherfucker. Hey, it didn't even cost us precious loot. Look at that. Yeah, surprisingly this giant fuck-off devil weighs only 160 pounds. Which may sound like a lot to throw around, but there's a reason this lady wanted the gauntlets of healed giant strength so she could, quote, carry around all of her precious stock without the need of a team of oxen. With 27 strength, our carry weight is 27 times 10 plus 40 kilograms. That is 680 pounds. We could hypothetically carry around 4 Raphaels and toss them around the place like squeaky toys if we really wanted to. In fact, on that note, for context on how much we can throw, the formula seems to be 0.2 times strength squared kilograms, which with 27 strength, maths out to 145 kilograms, or 320 pounds. I'll concede I don't know how this system works exactly. I'm kind of just hoping that the BG3 wiki is accurate, but if this equation rounds up, we would hypothetically be able to dual-wield opposing Raphaels. So, yeah, the problem isn't that the game is now too hard. The problem is that Shadow Davey cannot currently survive these lengthy encounters while I'm able to decimate them fairly easily. So we need to do something. Like, what if we just prohibit the ability to deal range damage? That way we have to go directly onto the front line so that we can't abuse shit like this, and we're more vulnerable to getting blasted both by our enemies and our doppelganger. Alright, let's try it at least. Real quick though, what's a melee class that scales well with strength and constitution, but also primarily scales off of a different ability? Oh yeah, Paladin. We are warriors, born from the light, an army for freedom, defenders of life. Hell, later on we could even go for some cheeky lock-it-in action, but I decided to start with pure Paladin instead of my usual multi-classing antics, and then a new problem emerged. I am way too goddamn tanky. And this is with a build that, for all intents and purposes, prioritized dealing damage rather than mitigating it. So, being able to tank 30 plus fireballs surely isn't an acceptable compromise. I mean, I could also buff Shadow Davey even further, but at that point I'm kind of just making the game easier rather than harder. So, what else can I do here? Well, as I've talked about way earlier, I already tried to get Shadow Davey a companion in Death and Autism, but the problems mentioned there still remain. It'd be more or less impossible to tune it in a way that makes the game more difficult, so that's also a bust. I also attempted to make the default AI the same as the Madness AI, or alternatively just inflicting every NPC in the game with madness, but that actually made everything way easier because enemies were extremely likely to condense into one big death ball that would promptly get AoE down insanely quickly. But I really liked the idea. During testing, I thoroughly believed the concept had merit, so I just had to sit down and ponder what I liked about it, and what I disliked about it, and how I could remedy it, and then it hit me. The obvious next step. No more infinite health scaling, no more enemy buffs, no more arbitrary rules. I know what I have to do. Remove me from the equation. My character is now Madness. It's everything I could have wanted and more. I love this. Also, in case you're wondering, I did consider resetting Act 3, but since we've actually made a fair few mistakes on the way here, such as letting a child die in our camp that just stays there forever, like what the fuck, as well as allowing Orin to kidnap Lae'zel, Volo's rather unceremonious death, forgetting to talk to the strange ox before traveling to the central city, and promptly having a schizophrenic conversation where I hallucinate its existence, Hope becoming mentally stunlocked for all eternity before I throw Raphael at her in displeasure, and finally not getting that permanent bless effect I mentioned earlier, which is honestly the thing I'm the most upset about. So yeah, I decided to stick with the run because I feel like resetting it would give me ample time to consider and properly remedy my mistakes, and overall, not a fan of that. But with this new direction in mind, it's time for yet another respec. Don't get me wrong, Paladin would still be an incredible choice for us, but the problem is that it's extremely easy for us to massacre civilians, and that tends to break our oath. And as good as Oathbreaker is, with us losing control over our character, we definitely need a simpler build that can sustain itself, and losing out on Aura of Warding really hurts the Paladin in that regard. So with this in mind, let me hit you with the easiest rhetorical question of all time. What is the simplest class in the game that is impossible to fuck up? Pure Fighter, baby. Not even Battlemaster, because that allows our Fisher-Price AI the possibility of making a decision, and we do not stand for that here. Champion. You approach the complex problems posed by combat with one distinctly effective solution. You hit those problems. Really quite hard. Okay, genuinely though, the reason why I wanted to go for such a straightforward build is because the Madness AI is surprisingly crafty. Crafty usually has a positive connotation to it though. What I mean in this case is that I had to get rid of my bow that was more or less a stat stick because my character was much more fond of using it over his giant legendary fuck-off hammer. Same thing with consumables. If there was something I could use in battle that wasn't left click, the AI would attempt to cook, and sometimes it'd lead to good results. Other times, I'd drink an elixir of arcane cultivation that I forgot to vendor, which would reset my strength to 0 for absolutely no gain. Then I'd run up to an enemy, throw spider eggs at them, then realize that I'm now surrounded by spiders, and throw a grenade at the spiders in melee range and perish. Yeah, there's a few reasons why I had to spend so long fine-tuning Shadow Davey's loadout at the beginning of the game, and although it only took about 30 minutes here because of the glory of hindsight, it was still just an adventure. Anyways, with all that said, you may be wondering to yourself, hey Davey, why are you massacring pedestrians in the streets in droves? Well, it's really quite simple. Saravok has a neat little item called the Sword of Chaos, and I really want it. Don't get me wrong, the Orphic Hammer is an insanely good weapon, but no matter how much I tinker with AI settings, my character isn't very fond of healing himself, so I need to trick him into healing himself by equipping a weapon that heals when he attacks. Yeah, we're more or less going to have to optimize our entire build, inventory, and strategy on protecting a single-celled organism from himself. More on that later though, because on the topic of automatic healing, we do have access to the Ring of Regeneration, but for yet another source of it, we also really want to get Balduran's helmet. Which of course means it's Balduran time. The Trial of Courage was surprisingly close because of my previously mentioned lack of healing. Like, in retrospect, I'm actually incredibly stupid for rushing into this, but despite the odds, we did manage to persevere with only 26 HP remaining. Afterwards, the Trial of Insight is fairly easy since there's only ever one answer, and I did decide to bust out a few companions out of retirement for the remaining two, but they were hardly challenging. Specifically, I summoned Shadowheart for the Trial of Justice to use Remove Curse on the Judge, although in retrospect I could have just used Displace, and Gale for the Trial of Strategy. For a bit of Davey trivia for you, I've actually never played chess in my life. Like, if you held a gun to my head and demanded that I move a knight across a chessboard as if my life depended on it, I'd probably sit there for half an hour before deploying an unpainted heavy battle titan onto the opposing side of the board and attempting to blast the knight with plasma destructors. So, although our life wasn't in mortal peril, and Gale was overall very polite and enthusiastic in giving us advice on how he would defeat the king, I just went ahead and rudely disregarded and crushed all of his passion by forcing him to just blast a piece with lightning. Which, probably unlike that hypothetical scenario described earlier, is actually a solution here. Huh. Well, with that mentally demanding puzzle dealt with, it's probably a good time to address the state on our party members. A rule set I eventually landed upon for them early on into the challenge is that companions and hirelings are allowed to be in my party and even used outside of combat, but there are two big limitations to that. Firstly, they can only join me in battle if they are fundamentally tied to the quest that I'm doing. And secondly, if the quest is impossible to complete without an action being taken in combat that our character is incapable of performing, a companion can be used to perform that action. But keep in mind that even if both of these apply, the companions are never able to take actions that stray from the intended objective. They're effectively there to do whatever they need to do, and that's it. Like, if a companion and their associated questline can reasonably reach a happy conclusion with little more than having the companion stick around with the Davey gang or even just joining combat, then all they can do is exist. And on a similar note, sometimes companions will unintentionally be dragged into combat for one reason or another, and when that happens, all they can do is sit there or run away. So for a TLDR, companions can't contribute to our fights beyond what's necessary, but they can be used in the open world to fill in specific roles or perform specific actions. You'll see all of this in action later on as we get into increasingly more complex companion antics. Compantics. But back to our Balduran misadventures, with all of the trials conquered, we didn't attempt to fight Onsor because... no. But we did get our cool new helmet, and overall, I'm a pretty happy camper with our brand new acquisition. Anyways, with all that out of the way, let's get back to that bloodshed on the street. Getting to Saravok proved to be a bit difficult because we have to confront this shape-shifting asshole before he attempts to murder innocent civilians in the name of the Lord of Murder. And fortunately, we got here just in time to stop him, so that we can kill the innocent civilians instead. Sometimes even the person we were trying to save. Absolutely incredible stuff here. Yeah, to say that this took a few attempts would be an understatement, but eventually I got past this encounter relatively scathed. But then I had to temporarily put a pause on this pursuit of justice to buy an elixir of sea invisibility and swap into my gauntlets of hill giant strength because... Remember when I mentioned that some NPCs had infinite potions? Yeah, this dude not only had an unlimited supply of supreme healing potions, but he also had an unlimited supply of potions of invisibility. And since he has multiple bonus actions, he could reliably use both of them every turn in combat. This made him virtually invincible without a way to detect invisible entities, and even with the elixir, he was still remarkably a pain in the ass. Keep in mind that he could still pass a check to remain invisible, and he could still take actions every turn which could be debilitating. And due to his invisibility, I was frequently getting blasted multiple times a turn by my doppelganger while never being able to heal or otherwise mitigate the damage. I really didn't appreciate my time here. But eventually we were finally able to kill him, which means that we can confront Sarevok, and I did have a plan here. Since this asshat was killed in a crossfire, we can go ahead and lead Sarevok to the sacrifice room with Valeria without having to pass a check. So if we want to be really cheeky, we can close the door in front of him and start the encounter inside of the throne room, and since there's no lever on the other side, the echoes will be trapped inside, which means that they will be entirely unable to assist Sarevok during the fight. The good news is that this plan worked out perfectly, and the echoes are trapped inside of this room. The bad news is that the plan worked out perfectly, and the echoes are trapped inside of this room. But if I kill Sarevok, they don't aggro off of me, which leads to a soft lock because I can't free them, and they're trapped inside, and... whoops. That's okay though, because I could just kill Valeria and wait for Sarevok to return to his cool throne room afterwards. Truthfully, I just do this in all of my playthroughs by passing that deception check I mentioned earlier. Not just because, oh, a character's mean to me, so they deserve to die, but because she's a lazy asshat that shouldn't be in the position that she's in. The city would just be a whole lot better with her gone in my eyes. Plus, you get some incredible gear by doing this, so overall it's a win-win. Assuming, of course, you do something about Sarevok after you collect your loot. Of course, the problem with this, and a thing I conveniently forgot, was that this puts you in combat, so no matter what, since our quick save was conveniently located just before this confrontation, we're now forced to attempt this fight in here. With about 8 trillion adds and even worse positioning. Yay. So yeah, this fight was pretty damn difficult. But after a few attempts, one of which was tragically close to victory, we managed to get the boss man down, and with our new sword, we are absolutely gaming. We even hit level 12 for the occasion, in which I decided to go for the incredibly bold choice of getting yet another level in Fighter. Ambitious, I know, but just give it a chance, I swear. With this new power spike in hand, we're going to find a few last key components for our new Fighter build, so I wanted to go ahead and discuss our loadout one last time, as there is room for minor tweaks or flex picks, but we're more or less in the process of finalizing our character. So for feats, I decided to go with Great Weapon Master, Savage Attacker, Resilient Dexterity, and Tough. The first 2 picks are rather self-explanatory. We want to hit things harder. Great Weapon Master lets us hit things harder. and gives us a lethal bonus action, which your build is kind of lacking at the moment. It's a great feat all around. Savage Attacker is there so it can hit things harder on average, especially so with a penalty to attack rolls with GWM. So these two combo together very well. I decided to roll with Resilient Dexterity for an additional point in Dex, but more importantly to help mitigate most of the 18 trillion spells that'd be hurled towards my direction. Of course, there are plenty of ways to gain resistance to spells or advantages on spell saves as a whole, but all of them cut into what I would consider very important slots for a character, so I'm totally content with giving up a feat slot for a slightly lesser effect. Although I will add, while doing some research for final builds, this extremely particular set of very dumb circumstances actually transforms one of the very worst weapons in the game into an actual S-tier threat. The Shattered Flail is an item that you can find in Act 1 that, just like the Sword of Chaos, heals you for 1d6 every time you attack an enemy. So of course, since the Sword of Chaos is obtained near the very end of the game, and the Shattered Flail is found near the very beginning, there has to be a downside to the Shattered Flail, right? Yeah, of course. If you don't hit an enemy every turn, you may surrender to madness. That would be a real shame, wouldn't it? Yeah, particularly because unlike the Sword of Chaos, you can one-hand the Shattered Flail while also wielding something like Ketheric's Shield or Viconia's Walking Fortress. I genuinely can't believe I'm saying this, but Shattered Flail is debatably our BIS. But of course, since I didn't enter this challenge anticipating anything that has fucking happened, I sold it early on because it's usually a terrible item. Especially so for a goddamn warlock. So, yeah, I mean, if we had it, it'd probably be in our final build, but alas, no luck, so we're just rolling with Resilient Dexterity. But finally, for the last feat, it was between Tough and Alert. Alert is typically an S+ feat that I think should be taken on virtually every party member ever in every playthrough. But, I mean, like, nothing in this playthrough has been standard, so with the biggest threat always moving first, yeah, I just haven't found moving second instead of moving third or fourth all too helpful. So we went ahead and chose Tough because it's bonus HP. Simple, but effective. Anyways, moving on to loot. For the helmet, we're sticking with a Helm of Baldur on, probably forever. There is nothing about this that isn't exceptional for us. For the chest piece, both the Armor of Persistence and Helldusk Armor are totally viable picks. In a normal playthrough, I'd probably go with Persistence due to the Helldusk Armor lacking a required proficiency, meaning it could go to a party member that benefits from it more, but with this more or less being a solo playthrough, I have to evaluate both pieces on their own, and overall, I believe that the Helldusk Armor barely edges out. The gloves are a pretty contentious slot with the Helldusk Gloves, Legacy of the Masters, and the Gauntlets of Hill Giant Strength as a flex pick, but most of the time I just rolled with the Helldusk Gloves. Even though I think the Legacy of the Masters is the better option in retrospect, to go ahead and say it outright, we're going to be obtaining and equipping the Helldusk Boots because they're more or less an upgraded version of the Disintegrating Nightwalkers, which would have been our pick for boots if nothing better was available. So seeing as we already have the Helldusk Boots and the Helldusk Armor, alongside this really fucking cool black dye, we may as well just finish the Helldusk set. For a cloak, I don't know, we can just keep rolling with a Cloak of Protection, I guess. But for jewelry, the Ring of Regeneration is almost always going to be equipped. Again, our fighter is incredibly dumb, so we need to spoon feed him as much healing as possible lest he just keel over and die. The second ring slot, however, is actually the single most variety we'll have in any slot. There are a ton of candidates for potentially incredible rings, but if we need a more generalized option, you can't go wrong with a Caustic Band. Alternatively, if we need burst damage against a single enemy or boss, the Killer Sweetheart really shines. The Risky Ring is fantastic if we need to push as much damage as possible regardless of our survivability. The Cryptlord Ring is also incredible, however that's one that will be a lot more relevant later on, so I'm just gonna leave it as a brief mention for now. Overall though, since our permanent bless effect is currently bricked, right now I think the Whispering Promise is debatably our best in slot. I mean, with our current build, it is effectively just a permanent bless, but it's one that comes at the cost of a ring slot, which kinda sucks. But what can you do? Anyways, moving forward, our amulet is now another contentious slot, but one with only really two options. Now that we have the Sword of Chaos, if we respec to allocate points back into Constitution, the Periapt of Wound Closure can now outvalue the Amulet of Greater Health. Specifically in tougher fights against enemies that can relentlessly tear down our high HP. Assuming we usually attack 3 to 5 times per turn, with the Periapt we can reliably expect to heal at least 24 health every single round. That's nowhere near invincible, but with a high base health pool, lots of bonuses to saving throws, decent damage mitigation, and the fact that our healing inherently comes from whacking people to death, that's really decent, honestly. Of course, the Amulet of Greater Health will be much better if we can expect opportunities to heal or otherwise rest up between encounters, but if that isn't an option, Wound Closure returns to being our best item. So with our loadout more or less finalized, let's smash some fools and blitz through Act 3. Keep in mind that I'm not going to be listing everything in chronological order, as some things are more or less important than others, but we investigated the missing letters and met up with Tara. We solved the Open Hand Temple murders, although we're supposed to meet up with Valeria at Shress's Caress to report our findings, which is a bit of an oopsie. Also in Shress's Caress, during a severe lapse in judgment, I decided to bring this doofus to justice for distributing toys rigged with explosives to kill innocent civilians, by selecting the dialogue option that promptly led to us killing lots of innocent civilians. How am I even allowed in the city anymore? We also hit up the Emperor's hideout, although I am very much getting the interpretation that we are not supposed to be doing this in reverse order. We helped Thrumbo and crew and killed Mystic Carrion, as well as whoever the hell this is, and Rarakan at the Sorcerer's Sundries. Then, following his demise, we went ahead and did all of Gale's funny business, ignoring all the traps because they can't hurt us if we don't consent to it. Told him, hey, maybe becoming a god isn't all that fantastic, before he had a rather depressing and heartfelt response to that. Like, holy shit, I'm sorry, buddy. But that was then followed with a casual chat with his ex-lover, and all seems to be right in the world. Asterion side quest, though, required a little bit more strategy. Fortunately, everything leading up to the Cazador fight was very straightforward, but confronting Cazador himself was pretty jank. We kept a very sneaky Asterion far away from the boss arena and passed a persuasion check to initiate the fight right here. But unfortunately, there was no way in hell we weren't going to kill at least one of his siblings, which really sucks, but at the very least, that does allow us to have Asterion run on in near the end of the encounter without being abducted, so he can have his little moment. Of course, this result is easily achievable without the death of the other spawn. Assuming Cazador is almost dead, there's pretty much no risk of Asterion dying, even if he does get yoinked. But I guess this completely mitigates that factor, even if it does lead to a worse ending for the cage spawn outside, so yeah, it wasn't optimal, but we kinda got everything sorted out. Sorta. But after that little incident, we went ahead and freed Forik from prison, then decided to visit our good friend Ansur again, this time with murderous intent. After a few attempts though, I quickly realized that without an immense amount of retries hoping for RNGesus to save us, we just don't have enough healing output to survive this encounter. So I decided that this was the time to respec back to my beloved, the periaptive wound closure. During this respec though, I realized that I never actually cured the condition I received from picking up the codex from all the way back here, which reduced my constitution by 5, which didn't matter when I had the Amulet of Greater Health, but now that matters substantially. Fortunately, though, this mistake actually ended up working out in our favor as I retrieved Shadowheart to cure the condition. And while we're at it, I decided to read the Necromancy of Thay so I could summon the boys, but much more importantly, I now have access to 20 bonus life on every long rest, which may not sound like much, but that's actually one of the very best sources of temporary HP in the entire game. Which will be immediately useful since we're back to fighting this asshole. And yeah, even with the respec and this newfound power, this fight was still going to take a fair few tries. But all in all, for an Ansur with nearly 900 HP, things were going shockingly well. We had to drop great weapon fighting so we could restore health more consistently, but we were still dealing at least 60 damage a turn while simultaneously restoring anywhere between 80 to well over 30 at times. So, although this fight definitely took a while, with Ansur's attention divided between me and Sans, with the latter having way too much of a health pool to ever realistically kill, we were able to eventually down him. In fact, we actually killed him twice, because I saw the Emperor pull off this epic maneuver before promptly exploding, which is always just an enjoyable experience. So, following Ansur's demise, Forik came just in time to tell us about the legendary dragon hidden deep beneath Baldur's Gate who would rise to the city's defense in face of great peril, and now would probably be a good time to mention Will's predicament. Will's dad, Alla, Duke Ravengard, is stuck in super jail, and we need to find a way to break him out despite not having control over our characters, which sounds totally impossible. And it just might be, but first, let's go ahead and fight Auntie Ethel. Look, I promise I'm not procrastinating, this will actually be relevant later. So let me tell you something. Fighting Auntie changes a man. Firstly, we had yet another public massacre with Jaheira caught in the crossfire since we were bringing her along to hit up some of her acquaintances, but frankly this is just to be expected at this point. Anything less than this is actually an anomaly. But once the bloodshed was finally over and Jaheira was no longer a corpse, we fled from the scene and met up with the Hag survivors. And although we totally saved Mayrina, she isn't here, which I can only assume is yet another unintended bug by those horrific and greedy developers over at Larian Studios. Despite this bizarre oddity though, meeting up with the remaining survivors allowed us to craft the Hag's Bane, that we can tactically yeet towards Auntie to free the child that she abducted. One thing I didn't do, which would have made things a bit easier, is doing this before confronting Ethel, as you can throw the Hag's Bane at her while she's disguised, meaning you don't have to do that during the confrontation within her lair. But truthfully, that is far from the worst thing about Ethel's boss fight. Unfortunately for us, that's probably the easiest thing to account for. So here's the deal. The encounter itself, in a vacuum, is actually incredibly easy. You have to remember that, as we've discovered near the beginning of the playthrough, the inability to commit pedicide is SJW woke nonsense, so if Vanra is freed, she's just immortal. You did it. She's saved. Good job. Also, another massively important thing that I discovered is that our AI more or less locks onto the real Auntie, so killing her is actually remarkably easy, even despite her shadow clone jutsu chicanery. So, all in all, things should be really simple for us, right? Right? Wrong. I got walled here for 3 hours. Do you wanna know why? Fucking mushrooms. And no, not the drugs, like literal mushrooms. I wish I was kidding, but they are not a consideration for the AI to target. At all, as in, even in optimal conditions where every enemy has been defeated and they still have actions available during their turn, they will not attack them. Full stop. And if this was all there was to it, it'd be a really unfun softlock akin to the Servox situation, but no. These mushrooms have tricks up their sleeves. And very unfortunate ones at that. You see, the really fun part about this is that if any of the mushrooms are alive, just like the Disney Star Wars sequels, somehow Auntie will return. And unlike the fungi, this revive mechanic doesn't have a cap. You could kill Auntie a theoretically infinite number of times, but if those mushrooms are not dealt with, you are not leaving this encounter. So we have to find a way to trick the AI into killing the mushrooms, and, you know, the solution may be pretty obvious at first. Spam summons. Obviously, they can do damage to mushrooms by themselves, and with enough of them, they'll probably provoke the ire of Shadow the Hedgehog, and the mushrooms will take some additional collateral damage. It's a win-win. But it can't be that simple, so what's the problem here, Davey? Well, the mushrooms have 97 health, which is actually a fairly hefty HP total in of itself. But what turns this from an annoying road bump to a considerable wall is that the mushrooms heal to full health every single round. Joy to the world. So, yeah, we had to find a way to properly deal with them, but after a lot of trial and error, and trust me, I do mean a lot, I finally discovered 3 solutions. Firstly, the forbidden strategy. This one's pretty cheesy though, so we're just gonna go ahead and ignore that. Secondly, respecing into a fully dedicated summoner build, including some really jank optimizations like making Shadowheart use up her divine intervention so that it could steal her newly acquired devotee's mace, so I could give my summons lots of buffs in combat with items like the Reviving Hands and the Whispering Promise, just to name a few. This ended up working out too, however it was extremely suboptimal. Just like a DeviantArt OC, I went way too wide. Particularly the Dance Macabre and Fungal Zombies were actively detrimental, with the latter not even being able to attack mushrooms, which is kind of hilarious. Not very helpful though. However, the third and most simple solution I found is one that I discovered during some attempts with the second solution. That fight was almost entirely won off of the Myrmidon, Diva, and Mummy alone, with the Mummy being a particular standout due to their rot, which prevents all healing. Of course, since we went ahead and defeated Big MC and helped out Thrumbo, we do have access to the Cryptoid Ring, which allows us to summon the Mummy without having to dedicate to a build. So alongside a few well-placed potions of speed, this fight is actually pretty damn simple. However, you may justifiably be asking yourself, Davey, why did you attempt this fight so many times if it was such a wall? Well, simply put, the fireworks were fun, but were cheesy enough that I wanted to go ahead and redo it. But the reason I wanted to go for the Necromancer build is because of the Iron Throne. See, I told you that fighting Auntie would be relevant later. Anyways, the Iron Throne has a lot of variables in it, so let's take this one step at a time. For starters, we only have 5 turns to do everything we need to do in here. But fortunately, all we're really concerned about is rescuing Duke Ravengard and Ameluum. Regardless of how many we save here, at the end of the day, the Gondians aren't going to be all too happy with us because there's simply no way in hell we're going to be able to save those found in the Steel Watch Foundry. I mean, if they were tied to the Karlak quest like they probably should be, I could pull a legal loophole, but sadly, fate isn't smiling upon us today. So for better and for worse, rescuing them just isn't a concern in the slightest. Also, the loot found here isn't all too exceptional for us, and we only really have 2 objectives. The problem, of course, lies in the fact that rescuing Duke Ravengard is extremely difficult with loads of events that will occur, and Ameluum is on the other side of the fucking continent. So we really need to have a game plan before entering. So, of course, as I mentioned previously, the main strategy I wanted to try was a build that was centralized around summons. I very quickly realized that this just wasn't going to work. At all. It is possible to free people with Scratch or even a Deva, for example, but there are a few issues that arise that just completely invalidates this entire idea. Firstly, since summons can't enter the Iron Throne without the summoner exiting the submarine, me and more pressingly Shadow had to exit with them, which means that we're probably going to blast anyone and everyone who dares get within our general vicinity, including the people we are trying to save, which isn't great. Following that, secondly, and most obviously, if we're out of the submarine, I can't get my characters back into the submarine, so we're going to fucking perish. Now, in testing, I was able to remedy this by giving my character the Blood of Lathander and bringing along an additional benchwarmer, but for some reason, this was wildly inconsistent. I wasn't able to get it to work again, so this wasn't really a viable solution. But thirdly, although rescuing Ameluum is incredibly easy since he has the convenient ability to teleport himself and another party member to the sub instantly, Ravengard, on the other hand, is fucking impossible to save. Now, I do want to go ahead and disclaim that this wouldn't be the case if our party could remain in the submarine, or if I could get my character to reliably survive the encounter. In fact, I can say with certainty that my dumbass box full of potion strategy would have worked. I decided to load a save and try it out while editing this, and surprisingly, it was a massive success. Unfortunately, though, that isn't as effective when this asshole is out ruining our entire weekend, and it certainly isn't as effective if we are guaranteed to die, so we had to do something that we never had to do during this entire playthrough, and it's something I didn't really want to do, but it is in line with all of the rules as previously described, and I feel like given the context, it's totally justifiable. We need to bust out Will and absolutely deck out his character. You may have noticed in all of the other instances of companions joining our party, I never really paid any attention to how I was leveling them past giving them some survivability feats for HP, and that's because anything more than that would honestly just be a waste of effort. Like, it doesn't really matter if Gale is just this min-maxed monster capable of hurling out fireballs that deal hundreds of damage each, if the only thing he's joining us for is being present when we pick up a book. So most of the time when I level companions, I just pick options at random because they're essentially just cheerleaders for us. They don't really do anything, they're just kinda there. We do not get that luxury here. If Will is to save his father and Ameluum, he needs to be prepared. So it's time to start building. 3 Rogue, 2 Fighter, 8 Cleric. 3 Rogue is so we have Cunning Dash and Thief to unlock another bonus action. 2 Fighter is pretty much exclusively for Action Surge. And 8 Life Cleric is to heal up his dad and give him lots of buffs and extra mobility so that he survives to Carnage, all the while being able to tank all of the enemies. We don't actually have to deal with them due to the 5-turn limit, but we do need survivability options, which this build provides in spades. If you're curious about the build, I'm going to be displaying it on screen now. I won't be going into depth with it as everything is fairly standard, but in summary we want it to be very bulky, very tanky, and very mobile. So all of this, when combined with some valuable consumables, means that Will is not only extraordinarily tanky, but he also has several actions per turn, countless options to heal or otherwise buff whenever necessary, and he literally runs faster than Usain Bolt. That isn't even hyperbole, I mathed it out. This dude is a goddamn superhuman. So all in all, I was actually fairly confident in this build's ability to overcome the challenge set before us, but you may be thinking to yourself, what about the 2 Davies? Well, between them instantly perishing if we set them free, while simultaneously being extremely likely to attempt to kill the people we're trying to free, they're actually just gonna stay in the sub the entire time. I'm also going to be sticking with my summoner build from earlier, just so our 2 idiots have something to kill while waiting for our friends. Fortunately, their lives won't be in peril as long as they enter the sub on the last turn, but my character dying is still ultimately a fail state, so having fodder around to tank incoming damage is massively appreciated. So, with everything prepared, let's give it a go. We hop into a submersible, Gortash contacts us via Zoom, we tell him to fuck off, he gets rather upset about that, and we go ahead and let Will do his thing.
Coming through.
You're still alive. Hold on, I'm coming for you. Mazora's here, we need to get...
I will aid you as much as I can, but hurry. We have little time.
Okay, that was extremely messy on my part, but all things considered, that went perfectly. Hell, Gondian even survived, so that's nice. I suppose. Well, that's debatably the biggest wall of the playthrough down after what was previously the biggest wall of the playthrough, so I'm feeling pretty good about things. And surely that had to be the last wall where we have to free a character from captivity while ensuring they survive a lengthy encounter.
Your false face does not fool my eyes.
I will cut until you look like the monster you truly are.
Well, shit. Anyways, before we get to Minsk, we have a little bit of a predicament on our hands. And of course, everyone died, including all of the counting house personnel and Goldbeard, so I guess we will not be returning the stolen gold after everything is said and done. But we may as well make the most of the opportunity presented before us and steal all the valuables stored here, since nobody is alive to catch us anymore. None of this is valuable to me, mind you, but I'm sure it's valuable to somebody, so I want it. Yet again, my primordial goblin brain wants shinies, and there's a lot of shinies in here, so I stole them, and I feel absolutely no remorse. Also, since we had to use a detect invisibility elixir in the last battle, because I mean this sincerely, this is legitimately a candidate for the absolute worst fight in the game without a way to attack or detect invisible enemies, we may as well make the most of them and hit up our boy Oscar again. Fortunately, the manor was pretty straightforward with us already dealing with a mystic and obtaining his torch, but we did get trolled by the quest reward. Since we went through so much to free Oscar, including a totally unnecessary donation to him early on in the playthrough, we now have the honor of having a priceless painting commissioned for us, which for some reason turned out to be Jaheira, who was patiently waiting outside while we resolved everything. Which, honestly, I do kind of find hilarious. Like, the entire time he was looking at my half-naked Dwergar while painting, he was just thinking to himself, damn. Jaheira. And that's it. Full stop. Like, the dude isn't even aware that she's waiting outside. She was never involved in this quest. She never even entered the damn manor. He just wanted to paint her on a whim, and you know what? I respect that. Granted, I'd find it even funnier if he handed the canvas over to us and it was just completely black, but still. It's truly priceless. Thank you, Baldur Gate. But now we have to go ahead and confront Minsk. Fortunately though, this is actually incredibly straightforward compared to the last two walls. All we have to do is turn Jaheira into a fighter, gear her up, initiate combat with the Minkskin crew, then toss him across the entire room to an isolated area where he wouldn't possibly be targeted by spells, knock him out, then continue the fight as normal. This wasn't quite a foolproof plan. Things could still theoretically go awry, but realistically the odds of Minsk being killed were exceptionally low. In fact, with retrospect, I can say that the main complication in this plan wasn't Minsk, it wasn't the other combatants, it wasn't even Shadow Davey. It was this literal piece of cloth being the bane of my existence for some reason. There's also this dude who was twerking at me with great fury, but what the fuck is this? Why is the cloth bulletproof? Why can I just phase through it? Why is it here? I don't know, but hey, guess what? Minsk is here, Boo is here, and we're always happy to see them both being them. However, following this, I made a grave mistake. I went back to the guild hall. It went exactly as you could have expected. Now, I will say on a sliding scale between me not getting Crusher's Ring and Halsin's unceremonious death due to overstimulation, this is nowhere near the latter. I'd probably put it a little bit above Stardew Valley Minthara. But it was something I really should have just avoided by never revisiting the guild hall again in the first place. It was totally avoidable, nothing good came out of it, I made a mistake. Regardless though, besides the Steel Watch Foundry, which I've conceded is impossible to fully save, we got past some of the biggest walls that Act 3 has to offer, and really there isn't much left to do. Well, before we cross the point of no return, that is. Primarily, we just gotta hit up the House of Grief for Shadowheart, take out the Steel Watch, then confront Gortash for his Netherstone, and I think that's sort of it?
I keep having this nagging feeling that I've forgotten something.
Hey, if you forgot it, it probably wasn't all that important.
Yeah, I guess.
We'll be discussing this later. Anyways, the Steel Watch was pretty simple to dismantle. As predicted, the Gondians all perished, so since we have nothing to lose anymore, we can just sneak past everything with invisibility, head to the Foundry's core, and we can go ahead and... why can't I blow up the Foundry? This is honestly the most I've ever resonated with my player character, because I'm just sitting here pressing this damn button repeatedly thinking to myself, huh, why bomb option no show up? My best guess is that it may have been used in combat and I just never realized it because I'm frankly so jaded with everything going on, but regardless, I now need a contingency plan. Fortunately though, the solution was something I already mentioned. The Gondians are all dead, which means that Shadowheart, who has been patiently waiting outside until we hit up the House of Grief, can just turn invisible, run on in, use Speak with Dead on Xanner, get the code to destroy the Foundry, then swap back over to our characters who now know the code because they are psychic and begin the self-destruct sequence before Shadowheart can even exit conversation. Like, she doesn't even die if we do this. Legitimately massive kudos to the Fists for not only letting my girl interrogate the corpse of a Gondian that just spontaneously exploded to figure out the code to destroy the Foundry that they're assigned to protect, but also allowing her to check out the second floor of the facility afterwards, and even letting her flee without confrontation when inexplicably everything begins to collapse. So, quick question for those of you who know the D&D lore. Is Gortash and everyone associated with him canonically fucking stupid? Like, let's just take a minute to set the record straight. Ever since I entered Baldur's Gate, I have done nothing but dismantle all of his plans, including, but not limited to, the liberation of his political rivals that he imprisoned, and in the process of doing so, forcing him to destroy the super-secret super prison that he kept as a bartering chip for power. Then in the same vein, dismantling the very Foundry that produced the Watchers that were maintaining his rule, inadvertently killing all the engineers who made that very Foundry possible, killing all of the guards who protected that Foundry, in fact, honestly, killing almost all of his guards and followers, period. And really just killing a rather substantial amount of innocent civilians and bystanders whenever possible, and his response to all of this is to just hang out on the top floor of his cool boy castle, probably thinking to himself something like, yep, in a second now he's gonna come on in with Orange Netherstone and then I'm gonna kill him. Buddy, what are you doing? What's the game plan here? Are you just not gonna take any steps towards resolving this? Like, you literally know where our campsite is. Surely you could send over some goons to at the very least attempt to stop our apparent crusade to raze your city to the ground. It's not like we've been particularly subtle about it. I don't know. Anyways, do you know who else may be canonically stupid? Wulbren goddamn Bongle. I originally had plans to kill him following the Foundry's destruction, but unfortunately it appears that as a result of his numerous mental health crises, Barkus Root fused into Wulbren Bongle, forming Bongle Rubren. Our situation only grows more dire with each and every passing day. But with all this out of the way, I may as well go ahead and confront Gortash, and I gotta admit, despite everything I said just a few minutes ago, similarly to his fallen compatriot, I figured Gortash would be a complete joke of an encounter. but he actually ended up being a fairly surmountable wall. But unlike the infinity HP avatar of Merkel, where the encounter had 1,000 different things going on, there's only one reason, and one reason alone, for Gortash's insane difficulty spike. These goddamn hands, and I actually mean that literally. When Gortash becomes the Avatar of Tyranny, he'll tactically deploy Closed Fists of Bane that will deal 12d10 force damage in an area on the next round. And keep in mind, unlike most other damage types, there isn't currently a way to resist force damage. Now, in most playthroughs, this is a non-issue. It's hard to even qualify it as a mechanic because I legitimately cannot envision any player having trouble with this. The problem is that as an uncontrollable melee character and with this initiative order, they may as well be magnetized to us because they're going to be summoned right next to Gortash. Then of course their AI is going to take the most efficient path straight to him, which is likely going to be inside fisting range. Then we'll whack him a few times and return and promptly get nuked for about 1/3 of our HP. And on top of all of the damage that Shadow is blasting me with, even compared to Onsor, this level of sheer DPS output was just too much for my character to handle. So I knew I had to abandon my current melee setup and go for some sort of ranged build, but the question then becomes, where do we position ourselves? Because, of course, a ranged build could be perfect for this encounter, but it isn't really going to help all too much if we're still in the front lines tanking everything. So after some thorough scanning of the area, I decided it would have to be up here as there wasn't really anywhere else where we could set up a nest, but I didn't want to dedicate to a plan just yet, so I decided to mess around with a Titan String bow and see how things would play out if I pulled a Matt Mercer and stacked a few crates up here, and it worked so perfectly that I was genuinely shocked. So something that the ranged AI likes to do is reposition after attacking. Whether it's to get a better angle or to simply create distance, it's a behavior that you don't typically recognize until you start paying close attention. And because of that behavior, deploying the crates here unintentionally created the perfect barricade. Since dwarves are just little guys, the railing was simply too tall for my character to look over, so I'd have to get on top of the crates in order to shoot Gortash. And after I take my shots and use up all of my actions, the AI then considers whether or not to end the turn or do something else. And since we still had plenty of movement available for our turn, our character would reliably climb off of the crates and move back behind the railing where their targeting priority was essentially entirely mitigated. Legitimately, the setup was almost perfect for guiding our AI into making optimal plays. Of course, this was ultimately a test run, so eventually my character made a mistake and a hand promptly crushed my crates and my hopes and dreams alongside them, but this showed so much promise, I just knew it had to be the game plan to defeat Gortash. So I traveled all around Baldur's Gate to collect a veritable horde of crates, respect a Gloomstalker with all of the relevant gear and abilities, constructed this. Then I kept a summon on the high ground for vision, walked back down to the base floor so that Shadow was in position, flew my way back up to the high ground, leaving Shadow below to tank Gortash away from my architectural marvel. Then I sent our kitty to draw aggro that would promptly be redirected to Shadow Davey, who would usually kill the ads in 1 or 2 turns before all that was left was the big man himself, where I'd emerge from the shadows, start blasting, and... okay, I went too far. The AI was perfectly capable of doing this when the only action they could take was shoot bow and climb up crate, but with about 30 million crates and more than 2 actions available, my character would just kinda give up from sheer analysis paralysis. which led to the encounter being significantly longer than anticipated, despite the fact that, in theory, this should more or less be the ideal setup. But after about another hour of attempts, not including the nearly half an hour it took just to set this up, we finally had the run where my character was capable of taking actions, and we acquired the second Netherstone. Joyous day. Oh shit, I forgot to take along, you know, the person who is insanely relevant to this entire plotline. Look, I'm sorry, but I was just so enamored with the crate strategy that I entirely forgot. I did at least take her to see his corpse, though, where everything played out as normal. Or as normal as you could really hope for in this situation. It was really quite sad, honestly. Anyways, moving past that and on to Shadowheart's quest, the fight with Lyconia and all 8 trillion of her cultists is one that I'm generally always wary of, since it has the potential to completely spiral out of control if you make a mistake. But fortunately for us, it was extremely simple, and besides an unfortunately untimely explosion, things pretty much went perfectly. Of course, things weren't nearly as good for Shadowheart, though. I mean, holy shit, we're really taking the whole every RPG party member needs severe parental issues up to about 11 here, but we're gonna be there for her to the best of our abilities. Now, that being said, it should be mentioned that we did go ahead and interact with a Mirror of Loss for some extra ability score, which honestly probably should have been done way earlier instead of near the very end of the act. But specifically, I really wanted an additional +2 to Constitution, which would get us to a handy-dandy 19 instead of our current 17. Fortunately, with a quick respec to maximize our odds of passing some considerably difficult checks, we were able to achieve just that. As well as an additional +1 to Charisma, which is pretty nice to have. So now that we have a pretty hefty 19 in Constitution, this increases our health total from our previous 185 to 185. Huh? This really confused me for a while, but after loading some old saves and reviewing my build, the reason why was actually fairly straightforward. Apparently I was just on autopilot and chose ability score improvement as a feat over Resilient Dexterity, both after the Iron Throne and after defeating Gortash, and I legitimately just never noticed it until now. But now that we just have 19 Constitution as a baseline, ASI is no longer needed, and to answer the question you were probably thinking to yourself, every point of Constitution is currently equivalent to 6 HP, so we went from 173 all the way to 185. So a solid 12 HP increase for absolutely free, which in my mind at least is definitely worth the effort. But now it's time for the second to last obstacle in the challenge, and honestly, barring the Iron Throne, the obstacle that I was dreading the most. Orin the Red. So first things first, to try and make things a little bit easier for us, we're gonna go ahead and take this alternative path to the Chosen's room so that we can speak to Helena, her dead mother, and get some information that Orin isn't going to be all too ecstatic about. Doing this allows us to skip the check to free Lae'zel, which, to be fair, isn't exceptionally difficult, but it's nice to get rid of that variable altogether. However, after doing this, I decided to run into the fight completely unprepared, knowing for a fact there was no way in hell we were going to win in our current condition, just so I could confirm a few things about the encounter, and much to my dismay, everything that I was hoping could go right went horribly wrong. So, firstly, even if we passed a check to provoke Orin without sacrificing Lae'zel, If she dies in combat, she's dead for good, which is particularly damning seeing as she's not only level 9, but she legitimately could not be in a worse spot for this encounter. Now, I will concede there are plenty of ways to circumvent this. For example, stockpiling a few Globe of Invulnerability scrolls is effectively a guaranteed method to avoid her untimely demise, but that's not really the hard part. The major issue here is that we're in yet another Auntie Ethel situation where the cultists here have Sanctuary and their AI does not target them in combat. Which, of course, is a massive problem as those cultists grant Orin the Unstoppable buff, which reduces all incoming damage to 1 up to 12 times per round. And in a normal playthrough with a full party, or god forbid, a party you can actually control, this is actually a fairly simple mechanic. In fact, it's debatably easier to just skip over the mechanic entirely and nuke her down 100-0 in a single turn. In this case, though, yeah, it'd unironically be easier to spec into a tank build and hit Orin for 1 damage enough times that she just dies from cringe. Of course, doing that all but assures Lae'zel's death, unless we decide to spend probably a good hour or two stockpiling at least 7 to 10 globes of invulnerability, so instead, I decided to take the classic approach of OTKing her before we even initiate combat. And, look, don't even need to elaborate on what that entails. You know what's about to happen, I know what's about to happen. Let's just play it out. No commentary needed.
My faith will guide me.
Really, the only thing I could add here is that it would probably be more thematically appropriate to bring Minthara along since she has a history with Orin, but even saying that, I'm not sure if she'd be all too ecstatic about passing turns in a bubble while we take care of everything without her, so I don't know. Anyways, with all that dealt with, we need to talk about the ending because it's not great. You see, the glaring elephant in the room is that we cannot become a Mind Flayer because we just don't have control over our character. And since you not only have to open a portal to the Absolute, but you also have to actually enter into it, as it currently stands with only 2 party members, it is completely impossible to finish the game. Of course, a potential solution of this problem may be pretty obvious. Either side with the Emperor, or alternatively side with Orpheus just so he can sacrifice himself and become a Mind Flayer. Unfortunately though, that just isn't a viable solution, as you can't access their inventory or otherwise give them a proper loadout, and because of that, I don't want to say it's outright impossible for them to solo the Absolute, but simultaneously, life's all about saying things I don't want to say. I'm just gonna go ahead and say it, it's not possible. Even with theoretically perfect RNG and AI, it's just not happening. Of course, we could bring along a 3rd character to serve as a pack mule just so the resident renegade Mind Flayer can cast scrolls or even throw items off the ground, which again is technically in line with the rules, but let's be real here. Do you really want to see yet another Absolute confrontation that's resolved with a backpack full of fireworks? If you said no, you need to take off your fucking thinking cap, because this is the best ending. Look, I know it's meta, and it's literally the speedrun strat, but if you think this isn't the canon ending of Baldur's Gate 3, you're actually objectively wrong and should feel ashamed. I mean, it is worth mentioning that, as I'm sure you noticed, I brought along Gale and Karlach to the finale, and that was to make the point that we do have 2 other immensely bittersweet options available. Karlach can become a fully controllable Mind Flayer with the potential for some absolutely insane damage output. Mind the pun, but holy shit. And of course, there's always the simplest option. Just send in the living tactical nuke. I mean, that last option in of itself means that the challenge is effectively over, as it's more than possible to reach the absolute without a single combat encounter, but there are some extreme dilemmas to be found here in which option is the best. Frankly, the question of Orpheus versus Emps in of itself has spawned literal tens of thousands of heated forum threads. And shout out to Larian for stoking the fires even further, but the question of what the best ending for Karlach is also extremely debatable. But if you want to free Orpheus, all the while keeping Karlach as is, the only option remaining is Gale, which I could definitely see some people claiming is the best option, even if it is potentially a bug. More specifically, the no Mind Flayer ending. Of course you or the Prince of the Comet can accept the burden and have Gale sacrifice himself regardless, but it is actually possible to beat the game without any Mind Flayers. On one hand, it hasn't been patched out yet, despite being well known for a long while, but on the other hand, you're yourself in one scene, a Mind Flayer in the next, then back to yourself once you exit dialogue, so I legitimately don't know. I mean, shit, Orpheus doesn't even know. One moment he commends you for taking on the burden of potentially becoming a Mind Flayer, and in the next he commends you for being a renegade Mind Flayer. Larian, please. But regardless of what option you think is best, including the hidden Shadow Davey ending where they fully manifest the power of their Netherese orb at home, in general the game ends the same way. The big bad of the universe getting obliterated in a single turn with a heavily condensed thermonuclear bomb. And despite how tragic and bittersweet these endings may be, I think saving Baldur's Gate by sending this video off on a literal bang is wonderfully poetic. Please just ignore all the mass murders and crime. If you ignore that, things were vaguely a net positive since we got here. So before I properly begin the outro, I really wanted to thank you for watching. Especially because the last few months have had a particularly nasty content drought due to a multitude of personal issues that still aren't fully resolved, if I'm being honest. 2024 has quite possibly been the worst year of my entire life, and as much as I've become a relentless optimist and a firm believer of the indomitable human spirit, the indifferent cruelty of the universe has been especially keen on barging into my life with progressively larger bad dragon strap-ons, and I'm not a particularly big fan of that. But I'm really trying my best to get some decent progress on various projects in between everything going on. And I'm sure things will get better soon. Fucking hopefully. Anyways, I really wanted to take this as an opportunity to give a much larger than normal thank you to my current patrons and YouTube members. Currently including, but limited to, Maggie Danger, Cassie42, Luke GB, Cork Attack, Safiarter 201, Hornet, Ram XC, Preceptic, Space Drake, Vasel V, Henry, Elliot R, Skrunkledunkle, Delta 7B, Bulldog Monnery, Tom B, The Muppet Guy, Mikolai, Asphalt, Cassie, Scrandle, Andrew F, Blue Sailor, Morphus, Inferno Kieran, Lungulus, Baja Blast Enthusiast, Frank, Hannah K, Anon 1, Al Diaz, Wumpus, Scremio, Tichu Boy, Darling Mim, Just a Plaid Shirt, Dan, Black Jade, Jacob S, Michael P, Breadman, Catapult Man 1, Judge and Jury, Scorner Crystalline, Teddy Bear Guy, MOS, Mr. Bones, Pyromusical, and Blazeheart. I know that the list of members is getting absurdly long, to the point that, speaking from a strictly algorithmic perspective, it would actually be preferable to cut this section off entirely as to retain more average watch time analytics. But of course, I really don't think I'm somebody who's well known for gaming the algorithm, so I'm not going to do that, as there isn't a day that goes by where I'm not thankful for the support given to me and to be able to do what I do as a full-time creator, and I want to make that known. Especially in an industry that's well known for narcissism and avarice, I think it's always important to remind you that you owe YouTube creators absolutely fucking nothing, and that the decision to be here with me is more than I could ever ask for. And I'm sincerely glad to have you here. Regardless of whether or not you support me directly, or extra directly, I hope that I can continue to make dumbass videos that you can enjoy even during dark times. Anyways, it is currently 4:55 AM, the day before this video is published, so I probably gotta stop talking soon. Both for your sake and for mine, so remember, I'm keeping that taken, it really sells the exhaustion. I even hear a little render notification pop up there. How cute.
The terrible tyrant himself. Strike him down, Bug.